I knew it was going to happen. Hi, everybody. Welcome again. Yeah, I'm going to thank you. Thank you, Toby. That was the biggest faux pas we had. I'm going to stop the video for the folks for a moment. Or I don't know how to center it. I'm unmuted now. Thank you. Okay, let's begin again. So hi, welcome again to the workshop on surfaces and neo-hylomorphisms. We're going to go through the schedule that we have on the CRASSH website, and I'll introduce each speaker as in the order that they have. So we'll begin with Adam Rosenthal. Adam Rosenthal is Associate Professor of French and Global Studies at Texas A&M University. He received his PhD in Comparative Literature from Emory University in 2014. His first book, Poetics and the Gift, Reading Poetry from Homer to Derrida, traces the expansive role of gifts and gift-giving in Western poetry, while his second book, Prosthetic Immortalities, Biology, Transhumanism, and the Search for Indefinite Life, asks how philosophical, poetic, and religious tropes of immortality inform biological and transhuman notions of immortal and indefinite life. He has published essays in Substance, Poetics Today, Oxford Literary Review, and MLN. He's an associate editor for the journal Derrida Today and leads the Humanities and Anthropocene Initiative for Texas A&M's Glasgow Center for Humanities Research. He's currently working on two projects. The first, Archives Organic and Inorganic, towards a new history of life in deconstruction, develops the implications of Walter Benjamin and Jacques Derrida's writings on history and the traits for understanding relation between life and non-life. The second, Biophilology, Readings in the History of Life, argues that the life sciences are, at their core, philological disciplines and attempts to realize a new biology, now as unrestricted philology of the living archive. In April of 2025, he will be visiting professor to liberal arts at the University Adolfo Ibáñez, Santiago, Chile. Okay, let's introduce Adam.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to try to find the right orient, or I guess I'm off. I don't know. Okay, that works. So let's go here. Nope, there we are. Let's begin at the beginning.
You're sharing the screen, though.
Am I sharing the screen? Oh, you might have to do that for me.
Have to?
Well, I don't know that I don't want to map.
I mean, we're the host, so it should be.
Share buttons and watching that.
Oh, thank you. We can just share the whole screen if you prefer, or just.
That's fine. Yeah, that's good. I've given up any supposed knowledge of how Zoom works. There we are. Here we go. Okay. Let me begin with a brief epigraph. From one to the other passes the light and violent tension of that suspension of meaning which comprises all meaning, that jouissance so absolute that it accedes to its own joy only by losing itself in it, by spilling itself into it, and it appears as the absent heart, absence which beats like a heart, of presence. It is the heart of things which is exscripted. How to express the proper level of enthusiasm? I am positively sanguine to be here. That is, buoyant, overjoyed, bubbly, but also a little red. By which I mean ruddy, hot, and even a bit flushed. Though I assure you not at all bloodthirsty. I'm ecstatic to be able to consider thinking surfaces with you all today, and at least if I can help it, I promise not to shed any blood while doing so. Thinking surfaces. I sat with this title and with James' project as a whole for some time. Many things stood out to me, and given the chance, I would have loved to be able to tell not just one, but many stories on, but also with, or through the full range of thinking surfaces we have at our disposal. That is what this project deserves. As many substrates, surfaces, and skins as possible, each of which would offer not only new reflections, but new modes of reflection, with which to become more and more enmeshed. Alas, I had to choose but one. And so my story, for that is what I'll be doing today, telling a story, will focus on thinking surfaces at the heart of life. At the heart of life. That is to say, at bottom, where origin meets essence. The problem of life, at bottom, perhaps boils down to an enormous problem of surfaces. That's what I'd like to suggest. Membranous surfaces that alternately open and close, yes, but also ones that, in doing so, articulate inside and out, performing difference in novel, unanticipatable fashion. In the beginning was the surface. Neither word nor act, this pseudo-skin, nevertheless, conditioned everything to come, up through and including what we call the heart. To be clear, and as I will attempt to show, nothing at the origin dictated that the heart, what we call heart, would one day come to resemble the four-chambered organ we now know by that name. It might have been otherwise. And yet, that I stand before you, speaking red-blooded and sanguine that I am, bespeaks the long legacy of surfaces at life's core. To be sanguine, red, and flushed with pumped blood, in short, is thinkable only on this condition. On the condition of a series of bifurcations within the history of life that would forever entangle soma and skin as surface effects. And so the thread I'll try to reconstitute for you now is that which connects intravenously the surface at the heart of life with the heart as surface. The heart, as everyone knows, is a pump. Yet if one begins with the mechano-organological, that is, with the kinetics of fluid dynamics, which regulate the uses of pumps, tubes, valves, and siphons, one will never grasp the nature of the vascular. At its core, the essence of the heart is nothing coronary. This is, I think, one of the great promises of thinking surfaces of inscription, a phrase that I take from James' work, and that has made a great impression on me. Far from an offshoot of surface reading, reading the organ as surface opens onto the writing of organogenesis. Instead of asking, what does the heart do? Our question becomes, to what problem does the heart respond? How, in sum, does one become heart? How does the heart write itself? Qua surface of inscription, the heart is both inscribed, a kind of evolutionary tattooing, and substrate of inscription, that which allows for novel forms of body writing. A surface of inscription is by nature an archive. It is an archived technicity of archivization. And so what I'd like to do is reread coronary inscription, somatization, or archivization as the surface effect that it is, beginning with the membranous origins of life. In the beginning was the membrane. Well, things are never quite that simple, are they? So I have before you just a representative work by a biologist on what some of the last universal common ancestor might have looked like. But as we see, very quickly, things were never quite that simple. The earliest cellular life was naturally membranous, encased or surrounded by lipid bilayers, which, it is believed, in sufficient quantity could have self-assembled, producing the first articulations of inside and outside. These are lipid bilayers that are thought to self-assemble in just that way. These are representations of the last universal common ancestor. This, however, is how we theorize the coming to be of the last universal ancestor. And so already there's a problem that the membrane at the origin of life there was something before there was a membrane. Anyway, we'll come back to this. So the earliest cellular life was naturally membranous, encased or surrounded by lipid bilayers, which it is believed in sufficient quantity could have self-assembled, producing the first articulations of inside and outside. Inside and outside in this sense name effects of spatial compartmentalization. But they also, at the same time, name regions of space with distinct properties, including the gradient that is produced by the difference between inside and outside. Critically, neither the gradient nor the distinct properties produced by compartmentalization is, however, simply a given. For each comes to be subject in its turn to the very processes of self-maintenance or homeostasis that this act of segregation itself canalizes, as well as to the possible failure of these processes. So, compartmentalization, the fabulous origin of the first surface, in other words, can in no way, shape, or form be considered simply as an empirical or physical fact. It is, of course, this, but it is not only or exclusively that. For it is also, and in the same breath, as it were, a difference that makes a difference, as the gradient produced by the division between inside and outside becomes the basis for further gradients, which would be impossible without it, including ones that support that initial gradient itself. There is no physical distinction qua surface, in sum, that's what I would propose, that is not without the possibility of some feedback of information, or even something like symbolic distinction, as the gradient itself becomes legible to what it makes possible. And so, the segregation of intracellular components from the environment by way of semi-permeable cell walls, what I am calling the first surfaces, because they are originary sites of what we could call inscription, but also legibility. This segregation is a gigantic step in the history of life, which contributes to a massive increase in organismal complexity. So viruses, as we know, for example, which can persist as free-floating genetic material encased in protein coats or capsids. Viruses, and the main reason why one will say that viruses are not alive, even if they are part of the more general fabric of life or the living. But the main reason why one says that they're not alive is that the reproductive machinery that they require for the replication is that of these encased cells. So this reproductive machinery, because of its complexity, appears to necessitate cellular segregation in order to get off the ground. All right. So besides allowing for the maintenance of concentrated gradients of ions, which permits the buildup of free energy, and facilitating interactions among its now isolated internal components, the membranous surface of the cell itself becomes instrumental for the self-referential processes that eventually allow for its own construction by those very intracellular components that exist on its condition. So this recursive causality of surface, which we could identify as a kind of natural end, as Kant defines it in the third critique, because it is both cause and effect of itself, also constitutes the fundamental element of the autopoietic processes that have been formalized by Maturana and Varela. Indeed, they equate these processes with the origin of cognition, by which we can understand a certain origin of individuality, if not of ipseity or selfhood. Though I'm not actually going to focus on the origins of either of life or of the cell in this presentation today, nor on the relationship between the first cellular individual and higher orders of individuality, such as are eventually found in the amoeba, the annelid, or the anthropos, a non-trivial case stands to be made that it is surface, for example, and not DNA nor RNA, that stands at the origin of life, of what we call life. Or, to put it otherwise, that it is surface qua surface of inscription, that is both what originates life and what life originates. Okay. I suppose that was an introductory section 2, supercharged and supersized. These earliest cellular organisms what would eventually become the archaea and bacteria of the prokaryotic or nucleus-less world were all anaerobes. That is, to be specific, they were organisms that lived in anoxic or oxygen-free environments, and whose life cycles, therefore, were led independently of oxygen. Indeed, for many of these beings, the presence of oxygen would have been lethal. The Earth you see was initially a water world dominated by volcanic gases, such as carbon dioxide and nitrogen. Here we have a little history of the Earth. So these conditions did not change, at least vis-a-vis oxygen, until about 2.45 to 2.32 billion years ago, when what is known as the Great Oxidation Event, instigated by oxygenic cyanobacteria, took place. And that green image before you is one such bacterium. The Great Oxidation Event, led by the greatest geoengineers the planet has ever known, microorganisms, filled the atmosphere and, eventually, the oceans with unprecedented quantities of oxygen. Though neither would reach contemporary levels until the end of the Precambrian period, about 1.8 billion years later, or 600 million years ago. So in this way, the oxygenation of the planet paved the way for an explosion of aerobic metabolisms, and with them, eventually, hearts. The Great Oxidation Event would mark a monumental step in the evolution of aerobic organisms, creating a niche for them and supporting both their multiplication and diversification. Nevertheless, the first aerobic metabolisms are actually believed to have preceded this event by 300 or 400 million years. And it's worth noting that according to some, it is even conceivable that the first aerobic metabolisms arose much, much earlier, before even the splitting of the three domains of life, and therefore the rise of oxygen itself with Luca, but that's neither here nor there. As is so often the case with evolutionary history, the niche, in this case, the Great Oxidation Event, does not produce, it does not cause the variations it supports, in this case, aerobic metabolisms, but rather facilitates novel pathways and adaptations for mutations already in existence. Novel pathways and adaptations that might not have been. At any event, the dual birth of aerobes on the one hand and oxygenic bacteria on the other is decisive in the becoming heart of heart. Their confluence marks a pivotal schism, indeed a bifurcation, within the history of life, which would, eventually, lead to cardiovascularization as the most tortuous transformation of surface. Cellular life thus takes an aerobic turn. Yet while this would turn out to be a watershed moment in the history of surfaces, it was not, in and of itself, sufficient to inaugurate any major morphological changes to life then in existence. And as should by now be clear, well, as I will make clear, whether it is or not, my presentation today will be heavily biased in the direction of morphology. We don't really have much morphological diversity yet in our history, so you haven't seen it, but we're getting to it. Morphology, the translation, in other words, of form into matter, or of information qua genotype into embodied expression qua phenotype. The case in point, it would take between, so the case in point of the oxygenation of the planet not itself being sufficient in order to produce great morphological diversity, it would take between 1 and 2 billion additional years before true multicellularity entered the scene. So the planet becomes oxygenated, oxygen becomes prolific in the atmosphere, and yet it will take another, let's say, billion or so years to actually have these fascinating multicellular organisms. So what is the holdup? Or rather, I have a side note before I get to that. So I said a moment ago that it would take another 1 to 2 billion additional years before true multicellularity entered the scene. And I want to note in passing that I will utter the term true many times today. In each case, it reflects a certain doxa of biological knowledge, aiming to distinguish phenomena, establish taxonomies, and tell salient histories of life. Yet, any real robust reading of the biological literature will see that these very same histories almost always admit that there are exceptions. And even beyond that, that the exceptions, that the limit itself, when we come to life, is never quite as simple as one would like it to be. So one of the possibilities of thinking surfaces I would propose, and be it by way of the heart or any other organ, is precisely to hold together in suspension the biologics of truth and the invaginations of border, both physical and metaphysical, which render those truths always partial. So how do we tell a history of life while also admitting that this history is, it's not fabricated, but it's not susceptible to the kind of, let's say, univocal storytelling we would like of it? This is an experiment. What I'm offering for you is one experiment of such reading, I guess I would say. So, from the origin of life, roughly 4 billion years ago, for at least the next 2.5 billion years, and by most accountings, the next 3 billion years, all life, virtually all life, nearly all life remained single-celled. And so another breakthrough, in many ways more significant than the oxygenation of the planet, had to come to pass before we would see any real progress toward the cardiac. I don't have the time to go into great detail concerning this second breakthrough. However, and I'm following the work of Nick Lane, a biochemist here, the true bottleneck preventing the invagination and involution of the surface, it seems, was not a lack of oxygen. Instead, it was a shortage of exploitable energy. To be precise, it consisted in the structural limitations of the prokaryotic cell to be able to convert food and oxygen into energy in the form of ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. The birth of the eukaryotic, or nucleated cell, which is itself a kind of formation of a second surface internal to the surface membrane, but the birth of the eukaryotic or nucleated cell, which followed the great oxygenation event by about 500 million years, would unleash the energetic capacities of life in previously unheard of fashions and allow, at last, for the invention of novel interiorities, as will be seen with the Cambrian explosion 540 million years ago, which appears to have been ignited by the effects of the rise in oxygen on this new eukaryotic cell. And case in point, the bacteria in archaea, which exist today, not unchanged from their forms 4 billion years ago, certainly, but nevertheless, there are many, I mean, thousands and millions of bacteria in archaea that remain single-celled, in spite of the fact that evidently the conditions in place for multicellularity are here. So that has to do with the nature of the eukaryotic cell. In any event, life, it turns out, had always been small. Not that anyone noticed. In all the history of reproductions, mutations, speciations, and extinctions encountered during the first 3 billion years of the history of life on the planet, bigness had never really been a vital possibility. But now, with bacteria-based mitochondria snugly situated in the ancient archaeal body, the cell gets supercharged and, with it, supersized. Part 3. Diffusion is not a mechanism. I began by putting forward 2 propositions, whose essential connection I aim to demonstrate. The surfaces I propose lie at the heart of life, and the heart, properly considered, can only be adequately understood as a surface, differed and deferred. To this point, I have argued that compartmentalization, as the segregation of interior from exterior through the formation of a membrane, consists in a spatialization decisive for what life is and what it will be. Surface is the name for this membranous border that is not one. It is an inscription, an evolutionary tattooing, allowing for further unheralded possibilities of inscription. The problem to which life responds, perhaps even the problem that it inaugurates, for who could have named it one before life invented itself as a solution for it, is this division. How to maintain the gradient, not just between inside and out, but eventually productive of each. Surface membrane, and skin thus articulate the morphological expression of a formal problem that is, I think, ultimately irreducible to the spatio-temporal. What we could also call difference, if we wanted to, but I don't particularly want to today. Yet so soon as life, the history of life, takes off in this direction, it opens, I'm arguing, the eventual possibility, or rather the eventual problem of the heart. So the question now is, how does surface become heart? But also, what does heart? I'm sorry, how does surface become heart? But also, when does heart become heart, properly so called? Diffusion is not a mechanism. It is the name for a physical principle that describes the regular movement of particles, usually from an area of higher concentration to one of lower concentration, across gradients. Within the biological sciences, it is most often used to refer to the processes whereby molecules such as oxygen pass through cell membranes. So long as the net concentration is higher on the outside than it is on the inside, and nothing actively inhibits crossing the border, more will tend to pass inside or down the concentration gradient. The surface, in this case, is a sieve. But, as I was saying, diffusion is not a mechanism. It is, if you like, a given, natural, a physico-chemical property or context within which substances and hylomorphisms, such as surfaces and gradients, arise. The surface in this case is the intruder, the latecomer, the prosthesis, or even the bodyguard. But to this point, all our surfaces have remained rather bloodless. Let's see if we can change that. Diffusion is not a mechanism, but it presents a problem that calls for mechanization. So long as life stayed small or single-celled, the osmotic diffusion of oxidants, such as oxygen, used in the burning of food during respiration remained satisfactory. Or at any event, and whatever the problems encountered along the way, this situation never gave rise to any direct bioengineering in the form of a diffusion supplement or an organic iron lung. I know, it's get the point. Life, in other words, never somatized diffusion, satisfied as it was merely to exploit it as a natural mechanism, which is to say, a given. Yet something happens when you start multiplying, to say nothing of differentiating, cells. As I indicated a few moments ago, the principal bottleneck previously inhibiting this multiplication had neither been that of oxidants nor of nutrients. It was not a matter of external supply, but was instead one of internal processing or energy extraction. No matter the quantity of oxidants and food available, only so much surplus energy could be drawn from them by the procariat because of the energetic cost of the process of extraction itself. Now, however, so that was the bottleneck, and so you can multiply cells, but you don't actually get any benefit from doing so, or rather, there are energetic limitations that make that feasible. Now, however, with the birth of the mitochondria-powered nucleated cell, multicellularity will arise, according to some estimates, no fewer than 30 times. And with it, on each occasion, new problems and possibilities of surface. Among those numerous emergences, the most significant for the cardiac is that which will branch into the metazoans. Before us, in all its glory, we have a member of the phylum Porifera, or pore-bearing, a common sponge. Sponges such as this asconoid were among the earliest metazoans to evolve. That is, sponges were among the first multicellular animals to come about after the nucleation of the eukaryotic cell. So this is just taken from a developmental biology textbook. If you see on the right at the beginning, colonial protists and sponges. So, in addition to the metazoa, the other two major kingdoms of multicellular organisms, namely the plants and the fungi, are not completely without interest for us, and I will in fact return to some important parallels or instances of, let's say, convergent evolution with them later. Nevertheless, because neither plants nor fungi embrace movement, quite like metazoans do, their explorations in the direction of cardiovascularization are heavily curtailed. Anyway, sponges represent some of the simplest possible body plans of metazoans, and while they lack both a true circulatory system, they have neither heart nor blood, and they lack mobility. All adult sponges, as you may know, are sessile filter feeders. They nevertheless represent a significant step in the development of the cardiac. Imagine that you are exploring for the first time the possibilities of extended body plan construction, or what is known as morphospace. The question arises, where to put your surface? How to arrange or organize your parts, given the now virtually limitless possibilities of the limit? I have a couple slides here of from embryology, which just will demonstrate how many limitless possibilities of the limit there are. This is just a couple of figures of early cleavage of a mouse embryo. This is the formation of the mesoderm in fruit fly. As you can see, right, we go from, I mean, this is a process that I'll come back to it later, but is known as invagination, where you have a border of a cell now moving internally to the formation of a new cellular level. And then this is, in fact, an inversion where, excuse me, you have, so this is a green algae, which forms this sphere. I think we would call this a blastoderm. And then at a certain decisive moment, so the very border of the cell, which had now been closed on itself, is going to reverse because the important stuff that was on the inside needs to be on the outside. So anyway, we're in morphospace now. Okay, so as we know, an embryo grows by dividing. Embryology, a field that has, let's say, more traditionally than other biological fields, supported various vitalist positions because of the wonders it regularly observes, studies the process of development from larva to adult. One cell, a zygote, divides into two, two into four, four into eight, and so on until, depending on the species, it reaches a certain threshold, and proper differentiation, something like a division of labor, arises. Under the prior prokaryotic conditions, each of these divisions, right, such as we see right in A or any of the others for that matter, under prokaryotic conditions, each of these divisions would have resulted in the production of free living organisms, so the cells split off from each other. Now, however, under the new body plans of multicellular morphologies, multiple cells can now remain together. With new morphologies, however, come new problems and possibilities, since if individual cells are now to be tasked with different roles, are to consist of different physical makeups, and are to be situated at different spatial locations within the body of a novel whole, an entirely new set of difficulties arises which were never before at issue. No, I want this. This is a blastula, a mere hollow ball of cells consisting of a single germ layer. Gastrulation refers to the process through which cells begin to diverge into different germ layers. So if we have something like a blastula here, you see how now the formation of a second germ layer, right, will arise from what was initially one, now into two, exterior and interior. So gastrulation refers to the process through which cells begin to diverge into different germ layers. We will come to the evolution of diploblastic and triploblastic animals in a moment, but before we do, let us return to our humble sponge. Here we have two examples. Though there is some debate as to whether sponges qualify as true diploblasts or not, diploblasts meaning that there are two germ layers. So sponges technically aren't even diploblasts, but that's fine. Monoblasts, I guess, but they're weird. Anyway, they have exactly, so sponges evidently have exactly not just two germ layers, but two layers of cells, literally external, internal. Epithelial on the outside and collar cells on the inside, separated by a layer of mesohyl, which is a jelly-like substance that serves as an extracellular matrix, so holding all of those cells on the inside and outside firmly in place. What is critical here is that the cells of sponges aggregate in such a way as to maximize porosity. This is what porifera means, after all. Porosity both between individual facing cells on the exterior and interior, and within their body plans as a whole, which can take the shapes of hollow tubes. Sponges, as you can see, explore morphospace by extending and maximizing surface area. Their bodies form in this way so as to create the possibility of constant contact with water currents. Not only are they exposed on all sides, but the ciliary beating of internal choanocyte chambers located on those collar cells are evolved to augment water flow. So, in other words, if we look at these, imagine that each of these sponges consists of two layers of cells on the outside. On the outside, this is the outside, and then on the inside, we have these little flagella-like tails. This is the mesohyl that runs between them. Okay, so they're exposed on all sides, but the ciliary beating of internal choanocyte chambers, the ones on the left, are evolved to augment water flow. The function of these currents for the sponge is the circulation of food, oxygen, and waste. This is a common problem that we share. Thus, and this is the critical point, in the absence of a true circulatory system, again, these sponges have neither blood nor do they have sap. Sponges have adapted a body morphology that, a bit like an aeolian harp on steroids, I don't know if it's literally steroids, but you get the point, harnesses the diffusive properties of flowing water and enhances it. Through the addition, right, so these little flagella here, right, enhance the water flow, increasing the presence of nutrients and oxygen through the water. So they harness the diffusive properties of water and enhance it through what in fact is a kind of Luddite ciliate technology that, phylogenetically speaking, had been around since the very first eukaryotic cells, the choanoflagellates, or among the first eukaryotic cells, and morphologically or structurally speaking, has had analogs for billions of years among flagellated prokaryotes. So anyway, this you can just see, this is a nice choanoflagellate, which are believed to be among, if not the first among the first eukaryotic organisms, let's put it that way, that basically consists of this single cell nucleus, and they've got this flagellum. And you can see, morphologically speaking, that the flagellum is like, I'm not the first person to point this out, but it looks very much like the sponge cell. Okay. I mentioned that sponges are not generally considered true diploblasts. They lack, it is said, both tissues and organs. True diploblasts, like jellyfish of the phylum Cnidaria, or the comb jellies of the phylum Ctenophora, do have developed cell tissues, while nevertheless still lacking organs. Their tissues consist, these are, historically speaking, emerged very quickly after the sponges. So these are diploblasts. Their tissues consist in both ectoderm on the outside and endoderm on the inside, again separated by a jelly-like substance, now called a mesoglea. Like sponges, jellyfish also lack a circulatory system. Unlike sponges, however, jellyfish both have radial symmetry, as you can see, and are motile. They move about. They clearly have a soul for Aristotle. Whereas sponge infancy consists in a motile phase and adulthood in sedentary existence, young jellies are sedentary polyps, while mature jellies become mobile medusa. The sedentary polyps, like many adult sponges, take the form of hollow cylinders, while the medusa bodies form in the shape of umbrellas, which initiate movement. Let's see, is this gonna... Well, there's a video of... Oh, okay, let's see. There we go. That's the one, this is the one moving image I'll give you today. So jellyfish, okay. So the medusa bodies form in the shape of umbrellas, which initiate movement by contracting. This is a muscle-driven process that propels the jellyfish by pumping water away. With the endoderm of the jellyfish, we have a novel form of interior. The endoderm, and you can see the endoderm, right? We have the epidermis from the ectoderm out here, mesoglea, that internal jelly-like substance that sends between the two germ layers, and then the gastrodermis is from the endoderm. And then you have the epidermis, as you can see, it surrounds it on all sides. So we have two germ layers, exterior, interior. With the endoderm of the jellyfish, we have a novel form of interior. The endoderm is a germ layer formed through the invagination of the surface. This is literally the word that the embryologists use. We saw the diagram before with involution and invagination. So the endoderm is a germ layer formed through the invagination of the surface, which will ultimately be separated from the exterior by the surrounding ectoderm. Developmentally, the endoderm tissue layer becomes the source from which the digestive and respiratory tracts will be formed. Despite, however, introducing a novel form of spatial depth and separation, jellyfish, like sponges, lack both circulatory systems and organ development, to say nothing of hearts. This is possible because their body morphologies, like those of sponges, are designed to maximize water flow. The power of diffusion aided by their own movement suffices to sustain their bifold body structure because their interiors, by way of the gastrovascular cavity, this guy here, up from the mouth anus, by way of this cavity, in fact, extends, we can think of it as extending contact with the surface rather than blocking it off. In this way, they maintain the respiration necessary for maintaining life. So, diffusion is not a mechanism, as I've been saying, nor for that matter is the heart at its core a pump. Instead, the heart will have been a diffusive surface, somatized, tattooed, and turned in on itself. These sponge and jellyfish, suspended between the single-celled and the triploblastic, do not yet specialize in circulation, right? That's what we've seen. That's why I'm showing you sponges and jellyfish, which you may not have expected to see today. They don't specialize in what we can think of as circulation, which is to say they don't offload circulation as the function of a specific organ or set of organs. They represent the limit case of whole body morphologies designed to maximize diffusion. Morphospatial explorations of a problem that no one had up until now been able to recognize as one. Last part. When is the organ? Something happens in the transition from 2 to 3 germ layers. A decisive event that not only dictates the eventual pathways of vertebrate evolution, but also inaugurates with this transition the first traces of palpitation. Of course, as concerns beating, rhythm, and contraction, we have already seen how they developed with the elementary rotations of sponge flagella, and then as the very condition of the medusa's motility, which was powered by specialized muscle cells involving contractile proteins that will later indeed be linked to cardiac muscles. These are, if you will, already somatizations of surface, but perhaps not yet endosomatizations, or at least not organological endosomatizations. In order for that to take place, and with it the first traces of what one commonly wishes to call heart. But as I have tried to show you throughout, if heart just names surface, differed, and deferred, if it gives novel morphological and mechanical expression to functions previously held by the membranous surface, bodyguard or mesh, which maintained circulation or passage to and from inside and out by manipulating diffusion, if the heart guards over this function, but now on the interior, an interior that it in fact makes possible, well, then there has always been heart, so long as there has been life. Nevertheless, the first traces of the organological heart appear to appear as such, neither with the flagellum nor with the specialized muscle cell, but with the evolution of this third mesoderm layer. Here, once again, is a simple diagram of the evolution of metazoans. And here is a possible dating of lineages. So some 50 million years following the first sponges, right? So we have the demispongi here, and then now we're getting into bilateral body plans right here. So about 50 million years, give or take, quite a range, but according to this diagram, some 50 million years following the first sponges, a branch of the tree of life splits off and invents, for the first time, bilateral symmetry. Right? We had radial symmetry with the jellies. Now we have bilateral symmetry. We are less interested in the reflective nature of the bilateral body plan, or even in the Hox genes that were decisive for its development, than we are in the depth of soma that comes with it. All bilateria, and so here we had our colonial protists. We have true multicellularity with the sponges and the jellyfish and ctenophores. We have radial symmetry, which with those guys. Now we are entering bilateral symmetry, which is further divided, which is great between the deuterostomes and the protostomes. We're advancing. We're making progress. So all bilateria, and be they protostomes or deuterostomes, organisms, in other words, whose mouths develop before or after their anuses. That's the distinction. So all bilateria are triploblastic, 3 germ layers. The mesohele and mesoglea of sponge and jellyfish thus for the first time becomes a full-fledged layer of tissue, the mesoderm. As we know from embryology, it is from the mesoderm that are formed muscles, blood, bones, and organs, including the heart. Yet the earliest hearts did not resemble ours. They were not, for example, separated into distinct chambers, nor did they have valves, but consisted instead in a single tube. There you have it. A bidirectional tube. The tubular heart mechanizes diffusion. Or rather, it introduces internal punctual pumping, where diffusion no longer suffices for reaching the furthest recesses of the interior. The tubular heart of the first triploblastic organisms allowed for greater depth. Because cardiac muscles are able to pump, which is to say, mechanically force, nutrients and respiratory gases to those parts of the body that had become unreachable, both from the outside surface of the external cell membrane and the internal surface of the gastrovascular cavity. Naturally, they do this with the help of vascular stuff, veins, capillaries. Veins, capillaries, arterioles, venules, and arteries, to say nothing of the occasional swim bladder or lung. I mentioned some time ago that neither fungus nor plant is nearly as much interest as animals in the evolution of the heart, because, well, neither kingdom has hearts. True though that may be, what both plants and some fungus do have are complex architectures of vascularized tissue used for the transport of water and nutrients. In the case of vascular plants, this consists of xylem and phloem. In that of fungi, it can take the form of rhizomorphs. But this is where the parallels end. This is Siona intestinalis, an Ascidian vase tunicate, or a sea squirt. Ascidians are invertebrate chordates, meaning that while they initially possess a notochord as larvae, as all chordates do, they never develop vertebrae, as nearly all vertebrates do. Along with the cephalochordate amphioxus, so here we have the little branch, we're moving up to the vertebrates. But we have the second arrow there, right? That's where we find our ascidian, our sea squirts. So along with the cephalochordate amphioxus, the vase tunicates are frequently looked to for clues as to the common ancestor of vertebrates and invertebrates, which, as basal chordates descended from a lineage believed to be about 550 million years old, they are believed to resemble. Of note for us, they possess an open circulatory system, which is similar to many extant protostome invertebrate species like lobster, for example. So they have an open circulatory system that is powered by a single rudimentary pump, with no chambers, no valves, nor even a set direction of flow. There, we have a diagram of one. Instead, their V-shaped tubular heart can in fact reverse the direction of its pumping or its peristalsis when needed. The tubular heart of the sea squirt is of interest not simply because it represents the first enfolding of what, over the next 200 million years or so, will become the four-chambered heart of amniote tetrapods such as crocodiles, birds, and mammals. Although that's kind of cool. No, but also because within the individual lifespan of each and every vertebrate, the heart, what we call heart, still begins as such a tubular pump, as depicted in this embryonic chicken. The heart, you may know, is the very first organ to be formed in vertebrate embryos. Indeed, in humans, heartbeats begin around the 21st embryonic day with contractions of tubular blood vessels, which initiate a unidirectional flow without the aid of valves. Now, a tubular pump, such as the adult sea squirt and embryonic vertebrate possess, is a far less powerful tool than the four-chambered mammalian heart. Between the one and the other lie not only hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary fine-tuning, but also orders of magnitude difference of power, which will enable novel body morphologies and abilities. Nevertheless, already here we see the first traces of sanguinity at work. The heart is a surface of inscription that invents new forms of interiority without ever abandoning the membrane at its origin. The surface membrane of the cell is a heart without heart, perhaps a heart exscripted, that inaugurates an evolution whose end we have not yet glimpsed, but whose traces remain in each blush of consanguinity and every coronary palpitation. Thank you.
One of the most common tattoos is the mom heart tattoo.
The which one?
The mom, the heart is like a heart. I just said mom. That is like. There you go.
Yeah. Do we have any time for questions?
So that's what I was going to ask. It's kind of relative to our schedule. I would say if somebody has like a very urgent question, you're not going to be here for later for something, I'll say like, let's shoot that question, one or two. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we'll move on, I think, to Cécile. So if anybody has, because at the end we'll have more discussion and more space, but if somebody in particular has a question that is pressing-ish, we can do that, no? Let me see also the questions.
I think we do have one.
Oh yeah, sorry, please.
I have a quick one. I have many questions. Thank you for such an ingenious insight and perspective. I guess a quick question I have is why have you chosen the heart specifically as sort of to theme your study? What's so significant about the heart? Because when you give the quote about Nancy, And when you talk about heart, and when we talk about heart in everyday discourse and literature, we're not talking about just narrowly the biological heart, but also something mystical, perhaps. You know, and so I wonder if that mystical aspect is also sort of subtending this biological scientific aspect. And why you have chosen heart?
It's a really great question, and I say that in part because I've also posed that question to myself. I think it's precisely because of its overdetermination, the fact that the heart has occupied this place of nearly boundless inspiration for discourses, both biological and symbolic, if you will. And of course, you know, I give you, obviously, I begin with the epigraph of Nancy, right, from a text not at all about his own experience of his heart, or at least not on the surface. But it's a tease, right? Because, you know, a certain version of this paper, I would have loved to come back to Nancy, right? And precisely his own experience and writings on, well, his own bio-exscription, if you will, of the heart. So I think what interests me is, or what I would want to develop in the direction of responding to your question, is that the very problem of life, at least as life as we know it, as it is linked to the earliest membranes and the earliest characteristics or qualities, the hallmarks, if you will, that we identify with life and use in order to separate it from non-life. What interests me there, and why I think it's legitimate tracing this lineage from proto or early life up through the heart, is that we see something like symbolic difference there. I approached that, right? I wanted certainly the interpretation of the cell as autopoietic involves a symbolic element. I think, to me, there's no doubt about that. But reading the, let's say, semiotic in the direction of the symbolic already at the unminded earliest kind of, let's say, recursive operations of early life, that's the interest in bringing in the heart. Because in fact, the biological discourse is already a literary one, if you will. But that is there's a lot more work that has to be done in order for me to actually show that to you. Yeah. But thank you so much for
this could be a chapter on the heart, then a chapter on the brain. How did the brain come to be, you know?
Yeah, of course.
How did the intestines come to be?
Well, and there are lots of other people doing great work on these topics, but I wanted, this was my contribution. Thank you so much. So I think we no?
Yeah, we can.
Thank you.
Let me just make sure that everything, and I'm not sharing the screen anymore. Yeah. Okay, now we're gonna move on to I will just introduce make sure I'm not muted. To Cécile Malaspina. She's the author of An Epistemology of Noise and the principal translator of Gilbert Simondon on the mode of existence of technical objects. She is directrice de programme at the Collège International de Philosophie in Paris and programmer for art and curatorial practice at the New Center for Research and Practice. She is based in London at King's College, where she's a visiting research fellow. Cécile is a member of the editorial boards of Angelaki, Journal of the Theoretical Humanities, Copy Press, and is a guest editor of At Nature, Humanities, and Social Sciences Communications. Thank you, Cécile. And
Thank you. Thank you. That was fantastic, Adam. Thank you for this invitation and the specialness of the topic of the invitation, which both brought me together again with Adam, whose presentations I can't get enough of, and I hope that you're going to see a convergence, although I don't have wonderful images to show you. It's full of mental images, but if you like, close your eyes and do the work. Can I maybe use this as well? You can't really lift it. Okay. This is good. Yeah, I'm a bit iconoclastic with these images. So, information as the chronotopology of singularity from Scotus de Simondon. And hello, I think this is the first time we meet.
Okay, but yeah.
So information is never deposited in a form that is able to be given, says Simondon. And I continue with a quote. It is the tension between two disparate reals. It is the signification that will emerge when an operation of individuation will discover the dimension according to which two disparate reals can become a system. And another quote from Gilbert Simondon, ontogenesis is an individuation, but it is not the only individuation. So all forms of individuation don't necessarily result in a given form or morphogenesis. But every morphogenesis is part of a process of individuation. The growing interest in Simondon's philosophy of information comes at a moment of peak tension between ebullient speculation about the evolution of intelligence beyond its biological substrates and existential anguish. Disparate visions of the immediate future now clash between the techno-optimist impatience and the fear of civilizational collapse. However, it is precisely in the tension between the disparate that Simondon's concept of information deploys its true philosophical potential for our times. And I quote him again. Information is never relative to a single and homogeneous reality, but to two orders in a state of disparation. That's the word that he invents for the disparate, an act of disparation. Information is the signification that will emerge when an operation of individuation discovers the dimension according to which two disparate reals become a system. Didn't realize this to say. Good as on above. Okay. So, what I want to do in this presentation is to situate the importance of this tension, which also was in your first Jean-Luc Nancy quote. I was very touched by this. To situate this tension for Simondon in Duns Scotus's treatment of the problem of individuation, namely in the topological tension between the bounded and the unbounded. For Scotus, it is the tension between the individual's singularity and its common nature. So in your beautiful slides, we saw the kind of evolution of common natures, but we haven't really talked about, we talked about particulars and genera and species, but not really about what makes the individual unique and what is non-transferable about the individual. So for Scotus, it is the tension between the individual's singularity and its common nature. For Simondon, it is the pre-individual and the individual. It's the tension, the relation and tension between the pre-individual and the individual. Scotus refers to the unity of individual and common nature as a less than one, less than a numerical, less determined than numerical unity. Simondon instead revives the pre-Socratic concept of the appeiron, the unbounded and indeterminate, to qualify the individual's intrinsic relation with the appeiron, not as a less than one, but as a more than one. And so I'm going to argue that this less than one and more than one has the topological in common, the relation between the bounded and the unbounded. And the relation as a tension, as a constitutive tension. I'm going to stress that Scotus's idea of a unity that is less than one, in other words, less determined than numerical unity, is in fact coherent with Simondon's idea that the individual's unity is more than one or more than numerical oneness. So how does this tension between the bounded and the unbounded relate to surfaces and neo-hylomorphisms, notably in contemporary materialisms? It relates because the surface I will foreground is a topological one. It is what constitutes the boundary between the bounded and the unbounded. Simondon's approach to individuation involves the emergence of an active boundary separating inside and outside, before and after, chronotopological boundary. A boundary whose unbounded outside is not a mere cutoff, but is constitutive of individuation. I quote Simondon here. Yeah, I'll just grab a little drop of water. The Ionian physiologists found in nature the origin of all types of being prior to individuation. Nature is the reality of the possible, in the form of this appeiron from which Anaximander makes every individuated form emerge. The appeiron is that without boundary. Nature is the appeiron. Nature is not the contrary of man, but the first phase of being, the boundlessness, while the second phase is the opposition of the individual and the milieu, the complement of the individual relative to the whole. According to the hypothesis presented here, and this is still Simondon, appeiron would remain in the individual like a crystal that retains its mother liquor. And this charge of appeiron that remains, the charge of the boundlessness that remains within the bounded, would allow it to go toward second and ulterior individuations, which we can now imagine as a kind of complication of the topology, a complexification of topology. We will see why this, so end of quote, we will see why this topological boundary, as both surface and relation to the unbounded, is directly relevant to a critique of discourse about information and the over-reliance on statistical underpinnings, for instance, in the definition of information as information entropy, like Shannon does, or negentropy, which pertains to discourse also about molecular biology and no less about machine learning and large language models. So I'll say a few words about cybernetics as the expert in the room. Be generous. To understand Simondon's topological conception of individuation, we need to understand his topological conceptualizations of information. So what is a topological concept of information, as opposed to the ones that we're statistical ones that we're used to? And to understand it as an answer, as a resolution of a problem and tension that he perceived to be within cybernetics and information theory. How does this topological approach grow out of the cybernetic and information theoretical moment? And how does it outgrow this moment in a manner that remains relevant today? In the mode of existence of technical objects, Simondon at first defines information as negentropic, like Wiener does. So I quote here, this is just a material. The machine
can be raised.
Or is that
knob?
I don't
No,
think,
that's a screw. That's a screw. Sorry.
I don't think so. I'll just hold it like this. The machine, as an element of the technical ensemble, becomes that which increases the quantity of information, increases negentropy, and therefore opposes the degradation of energy. The machine, being a work of organization and information, is, he says, like life itself, and together with life, that which is opposed to disorder, to the leveling of all things, tending to deprive the universe of the power of change. The machine, Simondon says, is that through which man fights against the death of the universe. It slows down the degradation of energy as life does and becomes a stabilizer of the world. So this is the first concept of information as negentropic, and we'll see later how the information feeds back into the problem of individuation. Now, it's not so simple. Information is not just negentropy, because only a few pages further down, Simondon is very sensitive to Shannon's problem of information entropy. And I quote him, but information is not form, nor is it a collection or ensemble of forms. It is the variability of forms. It is the unpredictability of a variation of form. This is information now, end of quote. Here prevails an idea of information that, following Shannon, implies something like, and I quote, a chance event. This is Simondon's word, a chance event, information like a chance event. But Simondon also goes beyond the statistical constraints of information theory, because at stake here is something that must be capable of bringing about, and I quote, a series of unpredictable new states not belonging to any series that could be defined in advance. So we're outside of a statistical framework here, outside of any set of prior incidents, events, or data points. Simondon here explicitly exceeds the statistical framework when he zeroes in on the aspect of information that is, I quote, and this is my favorite quote in the whole talk, the singularity of the here and now of the operation as pure event. End of quote. So it's a bit mashed up. This is like he doesn't say it in a sentence like this, but I kind of snipped it together to suit my purpose. Here, Simondon places his own qualitative and topological concept of information at the heart of his theory of individuation by saying that information in this sense is I quote, an initiation of individuation, a requirement for individuation, a direction according to which a system individuates, end of quote. So individuation and ontogenesis and information as tension of form at the heart of this. But what is individuation if it isn't only ontogenesis and morphogenesis? What role does information play in individuation? Atomism historically accounted for the individual as an aggregate of pre-existing entities, from the Greek atomos, uncut, indivisible, and in this sense, individual. Leaving the question concerning the genesis of the individual intact, this solution was not good enough for Simondon. Hylomorphism, in turn, posited the encounter of an amorphous matter with form, yet failed to account for the energetic conditions of this encounter, as Simondon explains by way of the relation between clay and mold forming the brick, and I quote him here, form-taking is the mutual operation of the form and the matter in a system. The energetic condition is what is essential, and it is not contributed by the form alone. The whole system is the center of potential energy. And the question in the room is, what is the system? Whence from the system? The whole system is the center of potential energy, the consequence of which is a state of energetic reciprocity of matter relative to itself. So inside this system and reciprocity, there is variation of form, ontogenesis, morphogenesis. Now, Simondon refers to this operation of form-taking as a process of ontogenesis. However, rather than, and I quote, the restricted and derived sense of an individual's genesis, end of quote, Simondon conceives of a veritable ontogenesis as the one that must encompass the genesis of the system within which processes of form-taking occur, within which entities arise. So the system doesn't, in a way, pre-exist individuation and doesn't pre-exist necessarily the system, although in some respects, if you don't look at it in terms of absolute beginnings, of course it does, because everything that exists around us is already, to a certain extent, systematic. So what about this emergence of the system? The emergence of a discernible structure in morphogenesis implies the transformation of energy into a state where operation and structure can separate into distinct phases. The genesis of the crystal, for instance, involves a phase separation that gives rise to the difference between a structure and its amorphous milieu. So the operation kind of freezes and crystallizes into this difference. Thus emerge a topological boundary distinguishing inside and outside, and a chronology distinguishing before and after. And Simondon says, the true implicit forms are not geometrical, but topological. End of quote. Information here plays the role of the singular path of resolution of tension, navigating the tension between disparate aspects of the system, which the individuation of this topological boundary forges. Now, Simondon uses Scottus's term hexaity to define the singularity of this process of information. Hexaity, but he has a different definition, slightly different from Scottus. It's interesting for me, but not interesting for today, I don't think. Hexaity is the singular thisness that makes something unique and universal. So talking about a unicellular organism isn't yet talking about an individual. It's talking about a particular instantiation of unicellular organisms. But the individual is the one that, if you had two identical apples, for instance, and it's not that you can, you can replace one for the other. Hexaity then is this singular thisness. And I propose to define hexaity of information as the singular crucible of the system's resolution of tension. Information, as I understand it, is the singular nodal point of tensions and potentials, which the process of individuation leverages. Hexaity, singular thisness, individuation, is thus not so much tethered to the Euclidean form of a particular entity. It is not the good form defined in Gestalt theory, that is, it is not necessarily the most salient or the most stable. But rather, information consists, and I quote Simondon, in these topological forms that constitute a parcelled hexaity, a parcelled singularity. End of quote. Like the implicit forms of a tree trunk, which include, Simondon says, slack undulations of the fibers, or their expansively spiral winding or curving around a knot. So it's this kind of leveraging of potentials, the nodal point and the crucible of a leveraging of potentials in the singularity in which it forges this path that I think is what's at stake here. So now individuation, according to Scottus, the tension between the singular and the common. Simondon poses the problem of individuation primarily in terms of a critique of Aristotle's hylomorphism. But it appears that the concern with the principle of individuation was only introduced as such by Boëtius, who was born in the year 480 and died in 524-25, and who laid down the principal terms of a scholastic debate that was to reach its climax in the 13th century with Duns Scotus. Now, the problem of individuation for Scotus is not primarily about what is physically indivisible, the atomos, or even subjectively indivisible, i.e., indivisible into two selves. I can sever my arm off, but there's only one self of me, I hope. Most of the time. It doesn't always feel like that, actually, but let's not get into this. It is rather about the singularity of the individual in categorical terms. The individual is indivisible in contrast to the genera, because the genera are divisible into species, and the species, in turn, are divisible into particulars. But the individual for Scotus is thus not relatively different, like the species is relatively different from the genera, but is rather diverse. So singularity is diversity. Sounds very woke, but it's unintended. Singular diversity is the ultimus gradus of difference. The genera and the species, on the contrary, are only relatively different because particulars of a species share in the same genus. indivisible, incommunicable, impractical, and diverse. The problem is that all these are negative definitions of singularity, of a singularity that constitutes for Scotus an ontological perfection. So why is it a perfection? It's both because it is the ultimate specification and because it is the actualization of a potential. So my cat Sappho is the ontological perfection of cats in general. However, Scotus famously also disregards all the positive candidates for individuation proposed by his contemporaries. First and foremost, among the candidates for a positive principle of individuation is Aristotle's notion that matter individuates form. A generic triangle, then, can be said to become an individual triangle because it is materialized, or when it is materialized. For Aquinas, it is a matter together with existence, esse. It is matter together with existence which individuates form. Another specialist here, so have a protective dome around you. It's very difficult to be a specialist of medieval philosophy, and I'm only a tourist. So for Thomas of Aquinas, it is a matter together with existence, esse, which individuates form, not a matter. For William Peter Gondilus, on the other hand, matter is the principle of individuation because it is the source of numerical plurality. Matter produces many individuals of the same species and therefore quantity. So numerical plurality as in quantity. So the first quantifiable approach to individuation here. For Scotus, however, the error of the materialists is precisely that they locate the source of the greatest unity, the unitas maxima of individual singularity, in a principle that is, on the contrary, the very source of multiplicity. Not only that, but if matter is defined by the potential to become whatever form it takes, then it can hardly be the cause or principle of the individual's actuality. As for actual existence or esse, which also Giles of Rome advocates for, Scotus says that without common nature, a notion that he takes from Avicenna or Ibn Sina, the mere existence of the individual will lack its characteristic determination. Such would be the case if we were to define the Socrateity of Socrates without taking into consideration his common nature, in this case, his humanity. The problem of individuation thus ultimately entails the tension between the singularity of the individual and its common nature. Just as humanity does not include the individual difference of Socrates, so Socrates does not include humanity essentially. While he is human, he is not all of humanity. Socrates does, however, contain both his singular Socrateity and human nature as essential to him. The resolution of this tension between singularity and its common nature is of no less importance than Scotus's invention of the concept of hexeity or thisness. So this is Scotus's other great contribution. Thisness is the ultimate positive specification of individuality. As such, hexeity is true only of this individual and not many and not any other. But this also means that it is a very strange concept because it is a concept that involves no quiddity or whatness that can make the individual like any other. What then is the relation of this singularity to common natures? Scotus proposes that there is only a formal but no actual difference between hexeity and common nature. Both are real and actual. Their formal difference is unitively contained in the individual. The individual, thus, is at once singular and hence numerically one, but nevertheless also what Scotus calls less than one because the unity of its common nature is not numerically bounded. So there is something bounded and unbounded, and it is unitively contained by the individual. And I would argue that it is this tension, that the function of the topological boundary is this relation between the bounded and the unbounded as constitutive of the individual. So how do we get from Scotus's less than one to Simondon's definition of the individual as more than one? And I'm concluding here. Simondon famously defines the individual as more than unity, more than one, more than identity, but precisely not in the aggregate sense of an atomist multiplicity. His insistence on a veritable ontogenesis puts the individual back into the system of reality within which individuation takes place. This, I would argue, means thinking of the singularity of the individual as formally distinct from, but unitively contained within the pre-individual state of being, and hence within the system that emerges and co-evolves with the individual. The system is not necessarily, although many individuations take place within systems, in, if you like, speculative absolute terms, the system is what emerges with the process of individuation. So the milieu also emerges with the process of individuation. There's no in these kind of speculative terms, the individual doesn't emerge in a milieu, but the milieu co-emerges and co-evolves with the individual, and the system is milieu and individual together. The pre-individual, whose ultimate category is Anaximander's notion of the unbounded and the indeterminate, of the appeiron, is of course a significant expansion of Avicenna and Scotus's notion of common nature, which referred with Socrates, for instance, to humanity, or the catness of my cat, Sappho. Nevertheless, I propose that Simondon's own definition of the term nature as appeiron tallies with the need to situate our individual, with our own need today to situate our individual and collective lives, but also our economic and political models within nature as what is not so much a boundless resource, but rather what is unbounded and indeterminate with respect to statistical models. The unitive containment of individual and pre-individual supersedes but does not cancel singularity of individuals. And Simondon says, the Ionian, I think I repeated this, the Ionian physiologist, this is so beautiful, the Ionian physiologists found in nature the origin of all types of being prior to individuation. Nature, this appeiron, would remain in the individual like a crystal that retains its mother liquor, and this charge of appeiron would allow it to grow toward the second and ulterior individuations. In other words, and I close here, our conception of individuation must include information as essential to it, namely as the continuous variation of a relation between the bounded and the unbounded, a relation whose tension is topological rather than Euclidean, qualitative rather than quantitative. Information thus conceived cannot be limited to the statistical set of elements, signals, data, and so forth. Although I'm not saying that statistics are not supremely useful and important. Intelligence and learning likewise must be sought in this topological relation to the unbounded and the indeterminate, rather than in the statistical sorting of tokens derived from within bounded data sets. Thank you very much.
Okay, so the title of this talk is This Superficial Life of Cortices, Narthexes, and Chores, or Chores. Thank you. So let me begin in a superficial way by asking two superficial questions. What is life, and what is a soul? As we know from some of the most recent developments in contemporary continental philosophy, the questions of life and of the soul and of their essential relation are hardly purely spiritual, idealistic, or non-materialistic. As a matter of fact, I will wager that the question of the relation between a life and a soul is one of the most, if not the most, material question of our time. A singular contemporary example is Martin Hedlund's book, This Life, Secular Faith and Religious Freedom. This book was published in 2019, just some months short of the pandemic, that we'll know, remember. The book proposes a connection between an acceptance of our material mortality and the possibility of a religious and political emancipation from the necropolitics of capitalism and neoliberalism. Another more recent example, and one that I salute, is Adam Rosenthal's 2022 book, Prosthetic Immortalities, Biology, Transhumanism, and the Search for Indefinite Life. A book that, for my own purposes, I call the non-dupe ère of life and immortality in the sciences. That is to say, the non-dupe are wrong or the names of the father of life and immortality. In this recent volume, Rosenthal shows how what we call life is built from shared fictions that can never be separated from the dream of the possibility of an indefinite extension of material life, or of an indefinite materially supported stream of consciousness, speaking of human life, as, quote, the possibility of something single, continuous, and present to itself, extension. End of quote. While both of these examples, Hägglund's and Rosenthal's, focus, for the most part and differently, on the dreams or nightmares of human immortality or indefinite extension, and on its material conditions, bringing up questions of the superficiality or topology of such extensions, there is a recent parallel interest in topology or material extension among philosophers of science regarding both the ontology and the epistemology of life. Such an interest has revitalized one of the oldest and most foundational epistemological and ontological theories of not only life, but also of individuation in general, hylomorphism. Two recent examples are Hylomorphism by William M.R. Simpson and the collection The History of Hylomorphism from Aristotle to Descartes, edited by David Charles. Further, even when they do not appear exactly with that name, my contention is that we can find revitalizations and reconfigurations of hylomorphism in recent French philosophy, as well as in contemporaneous studies of said philosophy and its main proponents. One of the main reasons behind these revitalizations is that, in some way, hylomorphism never really disappeared. It was just reconfigured in either deeply negationist ways, trying to detach form from matter in favor of one or the other, i.e. phenomenology versus object-oriented ontology, virtuality and simulacrum versus pure materialism, etc. Or it was likely veiled or warped into different dialectical philosophies, giving form and matter a variety of names. If, consequently, hylomorphism never died, and if it is resurging as a paradigm to understand biology, matter, and individuation in general, it is because it asks the question of life in its most material and formal way possible. In other words, if Rosenthal is right when he writes, quote, life contracts itself, it auto-affects itself, in and as the effacement of the trace that conditions it, end of quote, this life as an inscription, pressing or marking, namely as a topological auto-affection, even if it takes place on a simple Mobius strip, still always needs a material surface of inscription or appearance, even if ultimately it has neither substance nor depth. Only such a surface can summarize whatever happens in between form and matter, or in the between that gives us form and matter, or the soul and the body. My first section. Extensa ausgedehnt, first section. But where exactly does this philosophical surface come from? Or where did it first appear? In the history of the transmission, development, and warping of Aristotle's notion of hylomorphism, particularly through Plotinus, Suarez, and Descartes, the empiricist hylomorphic interpretation, according to which forms are always enmattered, gave way to a purist conception, splitting completely body and soul, matter and form. In this purist vision, each term of the dyad is essentially defined in contradistinction to the other. As David Charles explains, quote, the body was not simply defined in terms which did not refer to the soul. It was defined in terms such as being extended, which, in their view, no soul could possess. It was not just definitionally independent of the other component. It was defined as a distinct object possessed of essential features inconsistent with its being a soul. Nothing could be both a soul and a body, end of quote. According to this vision, extension, the essential quality of a surface, in topology, is opposed to the notion itself of soul. That is to say, it is not only contradictory, but it also is contrary to it. It is exactly its mirror negation. Such a definition explains the radicality of that famous late note from Freud, where he stated, the psyche is extended, knows nothing about it. The full context of the quote connects it not only to Kant's categories of time and space, but also to Descartes through the use of the German translation of extensio, Ausdehnung. Here we have the quote from Freud. The spatiality may be the projection of the extension, Ausdehnung, of the psychical apparatus. No other derivation is possible. Instead of Kant's a priori conditions, our psychical apparatus. Psyche is extended, knows nothing about it. End of quote. Besides the implication that such an extension in the psyche's ignorance signals the existence of the unconscious, Freud's late note also opens up the question of what exactly does such an extension implies as a psychic surface. As David Charles points out, this was one of the main questions of the other type of interpretation of Aristotle's hylomorphism, the inextricabilist one, which purportedly was an attempt by Aristotle himself to combat Plato's own dualisms. According to this view, which involves an impure perspective on form, not only cognition, but also emotion, desire, perception, culture, etc., are essentially inscribed and enmattered in the psychophysical inextricability of extension and thought, or put in Cartesian terms, in the singular surface that constitutes both inseparably and indistinguishably the res extensa and the res cogitans. Now, anticipating the essential connection Rosenthal investigates between the self-inscription of life and its ineradicable prolongation into indefinite life as extension, Lacan had, in his Seminar 3 on the Psychosis, shown how the concept of soul itself is defined precisely in terms of the permanence of impressions on the psychic surface. In the context of a reading of the first chapter of President Schreiber's memoirs, he wrote, this is Lacan, and for those who came to my first talk this week, the only quote that is repeating from the last. Quote, by a mechanism of the imagination that is not exceptional, we touch the link between the notion of soul and that of the perpetuity of impressions. The foundation of the concept of soul on the demand of a preservation of imaginary impressions is here perceptible. I would almost say that there lies the foundation, I am not saying the proof, of the belief in the immortality of the soul. There is nothing irrepressible when the subject considers himself. Not only he cannot not conceive that he exists, but also, what is more, that an impression shares in its perpetuity. Up to this point, our delirious one is no more out of his mind than an extremely extended sector of humanity, if he is not coextensive with it. End of quote. Thus, this extension mechanism is not exceptional, but instead is something irrepressible, a delirium to which not just some delirants like the President Schreiber are privy to, but also an extremely extended sector of humanity. This is not only, or not exactly, just the belief in the immortality of one's soul, but rather also the belief in a stability particular to the surface that takes the impression. In other words, in the indefinite receptibility, what is defined by the ancient Greek verb dekomai, of what receives. And this illusion or delirium, as Lacan points out, is also stretched out or extended to, if not all, at least to a large sector of humanity. Such an indefinite extension, comprehended not only psychic or spiritual extension, but also spatial or bodily expanse, makes Lacan ascertain a proximity between this omni-superficial vision and Spinoza's monoepistemo-affective ontology. However, what is even more interesting, at least to me, about this approximation is that he describes it as germane to the imaginary quality of certain stages of philosophical thought. And here's the quote from Lacan. We are not far from the Spinozian universe, insofar as it is founded on the coextensibility of the attributes of thought and the attribute of extension. We are in this dimension in order to situate, if one may say, the imaginary quality of certain stages or certain steps of philosophical thought. End of quote. It is a bit unfortunate that, in his original translation of this passage, Russell Greig translates coextensibility as coexistence, thereby erasing the folded repetition of topological extension in both the enveloping union of thought and extension, and as one of the elements of this Spinozian modal dyad of the unique substance. Existence just erases the spatiality as well as the topological and superficial essential trait of extensibility, which, derived from the Latin extendo, implies not only movement, but also a type of matter that stretches, extends, or spreads, becoming ausgedehnt. Now, going back to the image, or rather to the imaginary quality of certain stages or certain steps of philosophical thought, as Lacan said, Lacan leaves this thought at this point of the seminar, returning to Schreiber and his relation with God. However, the connection between the delusional belief in the immortality, or rather in the indefinite permanence of the self, and the belief in the perpetuity of imaginary impressions has been made, and what is more, through Spinoza's monotopological ontology, it has appeared as an imaginary yet necessary stage of philosophical thought. Now, as it is well known, this connection between the Lacanian subject and a logic of surfaces, i.e. a topology, will become the essential structure of Lacan's psychoanalytic theory at large, making of the imaginary dimension an essential, even if repressed layer of his theory of knots. Such a superficial dimension of the subject's essence will even make Lacan state, almost 20 years later, in Seminar 21, Les Noms du Père, that contrary to our common sense assumptions, human subjects are not three-dimensional, but only bidimensional entities. This is the quote. The sense of depth of density is something that we lack, way more than we think. This is to claim what I want to tell you at the beginning, that we are beings, you as well as me, of two dimensions, notwithstanding the appearance. We inhabit the flat land, as some authors who wrote a book on this subject say, who seem to have too many difficulties, at any rate, imagining beings of two dimensions. There is no need to look for them far. It is all of us. End of quote. This bidimensionality or superficiality refers to two types of surface or bidimensional plane whose function is to presuppose another side. The first type of surface signals the subject's essential visual structure. It is the screen, described by Lacan as, quote, the principle of our doubt. What is seen does not reveal but hides something, end of quote. The other type of surface refers directly to the place of inscription and to the difference between knowing, savoir, and what inaccessible to this epistemological dimension can only be revealed as truth, vérité. Lacan sees this double place of inscription as a manifestation of the famous Freudian dictum, wo es war, soll ich werden, where it was, shall I become. He first translates this dictum as, there where it was, there as a subject I must arrive. But then he modifies it, showing why such a dictum locates truth as necessarily contrary to knowledge, just as the extension vis-a-vis the soul in the purist Aristotelian hylomorphism. Quote, this is his later translation of it, how that which was waiting for me since forever as a dark being will come to totalize itself with a trait that can only be drawn by splitting it more clearly from that which I know. I know, Lacanian parlance is a little difficult. Thus, the point of this superficial topology is that the inscription is necessarily different depending on where it takes place, or where it bites, it says. It is a double inscription that, says Lacan, takes place not only in theory. It is thus through the topology taken not as a metaphor, but as a real structure, or the structure of what he will call the real, that this double inscription can appear. In other words, it takes place on, quote, a surface where front and back are in the position to join each other everywhere, end of quote. This is, however, the topology of psychoanalysis and not of philosophy, at least according to Lacan. But why not also philosophy? Does philosophy not, like psychoanalysis, imply language and with it inscription? Does it not entail a difference between knowledge and truth, as well as a screen showing something only through the veiling or occultation of another side? And does it not also have, as its voice or hand, a subject constituted in a bidimensional split between an exterior and an interior? And what about the sciences, empirical, theoretical, and in between? Next section, cortices and atours. In a recent interview, one of the philosophers who has taken more seriously into consideration the necessary contact between philosophy and the sciences, Catherine Malabou, was asked how much, considering the oeuvre of Hegel and Heidegger and her own work on them, quote, does plasticity question the notions of inside and outside, interior and exterior, end of quote. As an answer, she summarized her vision according to which, while in both philosophers' philosophical systems, Hegel and Heidegger, one must, quote, produce the meaning or the image, end of quote, one must not look for them, quote, in an outside of that which is, there is no outside, end of quote. Then, after the interviewer, Nicolas Tournel, linked this questioning of the notions of interior and exterior with a certain form of materialism, Malabou expounded, saying, it is exactly that. There is no outside, but neither is there an inside. In fact, the movement about which Heidegger talks is certainly a projection into the outside, or it is an outside belonging to the self, du soi. It is very complex. All of this calls into question immanence and transcendence. Heidegger and Hegel are situated in this schema. Heidegger called that ontological, and Hegel called it dialectical, because it was the in-between of the two, it was in the in-between of the two that one could find the space. It is necessary to find a space in the in-between, between the interior and the exterior. Without a doubt, that is the surface. This is what took me to the epigenetic, and of course. While once or twice Malabou had mentioned surfaces in her work, she had never focused on them so clearly until this 2022 interview, according to my knowledge. As I and other scholars like Alice Jacobone have remarked, this disregard for the surface in a philosophy developed around the notion of plasticity seemed peculiar, especially since, as Malabou ascertained ever since her first major book, L'Avenir de Hegel, the notion of plasticity originated in the visual or plastic arts, which, as we know, are all determined by their distinct surfaces of composition, i.e. canvas, paper, wood, synthetic fibers, but also skin, soil, even dried blood, and other bodily substance when we think of art movements like Viennese actionism, fluxus, etc. Even more interestingly, and germane to our previous question of how the double inscription at the surface that Lacan sees in psychoanalysis could apply to philosophy and the sciences, when a little earlier in the interview, Estournel asked Malabou about her work on cerebrality and the plasticity of the brain, and about how we are the living and non-living matter of and around our body, in the same way as we are our synapses. Her answer was not in terms of plasticity and omnipresent form, as was the usual, but rather it was also in terms of surfaces. What is more, the complexity of the bidimensional surface that she described is not dissimilar to Lacan, inasmuch as it involves a switch, jeu, of visibility, invisibility, and of what can take the form of knowledge, savoir, and what can only take the form of truth, vérité. To support this superficial vision, she invoked phenomenology, and particularly Merleau-Ponty, who, in her words, quote, draws absolutely no difference between the exterior surface and the interior surface, end of quote. Then she declared, quote, we can absolutely contemplate the brain as a surface. That is, incidentally, the meaning of the neocortex, an outside informed by the exterior world. We are deceived because we do not see our brain. But it is, in addition, an organ whose constitution is very complex, very obscure, end of quote. Complex and obscure, according to this description, the brain would be, like the body, just another surface, at least as long as we are in a materialistic view. After all, that is the meaning of the neocortex, and of the cortex as well, from the Latin term cortex, which also gives us scortum, meaning skin and leather, as well as curtus, shortened or circumcised. But are all these surfaces, especially those leaping from philosophy and phenomenology, and those of biology and the neurosciences, similar or even the same? What about the other bidimensionality of the subject, according to Lacan? Are these surfaces inscribed as truth or as knowledge? Since, according to him, just as the visible and invisible, these two types of inscription cannot be on both sides, at least not at the same time. The answer, at least in this interview, seems to lie on the notion of epigenetic, as a response to Estournel's suggestion that it is precisely the phenomenality of the exterior world that allows us to think the brain as a surface, and even a plastic surface. Malabou said, next quote, yes, that sends us back to the notion of epigenetic. Epi means on the surface. What is interesting taking place in the brain is on the surface, namely the interaction. The chemical and physiological mechanisms constitute a medical dimension that escapes us and which is not really useful for what we are looking for. What interests us is the emergence of meaning or sense. That is what happens on the surface, end of quote. Thus, on one side, lie the chemical and physiological mechanisms, part of the medical dimension of knowledge, which escapes us when we're looking on the other side. On this other side takes place the emergence of meaning or sense. What emerges or surfaces can only take its place on the surface, namely, epigenetically, from epi, surface, or simply sur, or over, as in the German term for surface, Oberfläche, or the Latin superficies, over and above the fascies, the form or face. As Toby Barnett there has recently remarked, Malabou's epigenetic paradigm can be seen precisely as an attempt to transcend this categorical distinction, derived from Foucault, between a philosophy of experience, the subject, and meaning, a sense, or sounds, and a philosophy of knowledge, savoir, rationality, and concept. This notion of epigenesis comes back at the end of the interview when, in his last question on the reader, Estornel returns to the passage from the predicative to the speculative reading, as Malabou described it in L'Avenir de Hegel. Estornel wonders if, to make that leap, to quote, be able to truly read, one must be able to remove oneself from ce désir, a certain knowledge, savoir. He asks Malabou about the nature of this removal or désistement and mentions three options from three different traditions. Is it about, he says, a Husserlian phenomenological reduction, a Baudelairean return to a childhood, a Socratic acceptance of no knowledge? The question at first reminds Malabou of a question Derrida himself asked her during her thesis defense regarding this désistement, or self-removal. Malabou paraphrases then Derrida asking her, you talk of a withdrawal, désistement, that is a decision, he told me, but one cannot decide to withdraw from oneself, so this is here. End of quote. She recognizes that the question was fair and that there is certain obscurity in what she wrote at the time. But then, apparently disregarding the Husserlian, Baudelairean, and Socratic suggestions from her interviewer, she turns back to the epigenetic. However, this time as a question of the origin. That is to say, of an archaeology, a code, an origin over which, sur laquelle, she says, one can do nothing. And then she adds, quote, it is precisely from that one removes oneself in Hegel, end of quote. And here, still on the subject of epigenesis and Hegel, she spreads out another surface with two other apparently counteractive, if not contrary sides. Quote, the subject is the essence, the predicate is the accident. If one declares that one refers to the other, one cannot make a difference between essence and accident, end of quote. If we stop here for a moment, we see that the topology of this affirmation is very complex, particularly in the context of our philosophical tradition. If the subject is the essence, that is to say the ousia, then, following our hylomorphic inheritance, this subject is the substance, what lies not above, like the surface, but below or underneath, supporting both subjects and objects in their thrownness. It is this substance too, particularly as it is opposed, through the persistence of its form, the belief in its immortality, we could say, to the accident or predicate as that which arbitrarily can allegedly disappear, be effaced, or simply let drop. In other words, that from which one can remove oneself. So this is here. Surprisingly, following Malabou, on this new old surface supported by a substantial essential subject, it is not exactly from the accident that one removes oneself. It is not even from the origin itself as a rebirth or absolute remaking. It is not, as she explains, a question of separation from the origin or the accidental, but rather from the question of the origin itself, from the origin as a question. The next lines in the interview are difficult to follow, and it seems that the surface and the depth are getting confused in philosophical and scientific terms, as well as in between them. First, Malabou states, quote, that from which one withdraws is from knowing if there could have been another origin. With epigenesis, we ask if we could have been otherwise, if we could have been somebody else through a simple modification of the RNA, end of quote. Given that early on in the interview, she had distinguished her project as focused on the surface of the epigenetic from most philosophers who, quote, still today think only of genetics, completely ignoring the epigenetic, end of quote. It seems that here we have the opening of a different question of the origin, or perhaps of the question of a different origin. But immediately afterwards, she negates this possibility, saying, quote, it is a false question, end quote. But why is it a false question, or in which space? The answer comes immediately afterwards as she continues, remarking that we are still here within Hegel's philosophy. Quote, quote, Hegel, it's his greatness, is a philosopher of history that, strangely, tells us that we would not be in a history if that which had happened was truly necessary, completely contingent. This question falls on its own. End of quote. The syntax in French of the penultimate sentence carries part of the difficulty, particularly in the relation between the last two clauses split by a comma. So, truly necessary, vraiment nécessaire, completely contingent, complètement contingent. In this hypothetical, the result is clear. We will never have in a history, but the condition is blurry. If what had happened had been truly necessary, completely contingent. What would have robbed us of our placement in history, or in a history? The true necessity or the complete contingency of the events? Which one is it, or is it both? No history and true necessity, no history and complete contingency. Perhaps it does not matter, because she immediately adds, this question falls on its own. However, the next line switches the subject, and it seems that what falls is not exactly, or not only this last question, which, albeit related, is not exactly the question of the origin, but something else, the decision. Which decision? The decision of the désistement mentioned above, the removing oneself, or more literally, the letting go or opening the hold one has. And here Malabou connects this not through decision, but rather this undecided, involuntary act of letting go to what it seems the Hegelian absolute, except that it is more of a Heideggerian Derridian absolute, one focused on the absolution of this moment. I quote Malabou. This question falls on its own. Here is why it is not really about a decision. The definition of the absolute is, in that respect, very interesting. The absolute drives one to let fall, laisser tomber, to separate oneself. End of quote. Finally, in a last turn, we are back on the surface of the text of Malabou's reading of Hegel, and particularly of the move from the predicative to the speculative. The désistement, removing oneself, or absolution, is thus still from the original text, or from the text as original surface. Quote, the absolution drives one to let fall, to separate oneself. Consequently, it is impossible to decide if a good interpretation of the text, a good reading, a reading that opens, is arbitrary or not. End of quote. In the last moments of the interview, Estournel and Malabou go back to the text as origin and to a notion of the epigenetic or the superficial that applies precisely to a textual paradigm. Estournel suggests that it is thus again question of a return towards an origin. And Malabou responds by asking the question of the origin of the text. Is it its first intention? She asks, and then remarks how Derrida's own notion of the supplement was a fantastic act of embroidering on Rousseau's own tapestry, an act that gave to Rousseau's text a new relief, unforgettable, she said. Thus, the surface becomes here at the end textual, or the textual more and more superficial. After Estournel gives his last comment, suggesting that writing in Derrida is a bit the supplement par excellence, Malabou agrees and then superficializes or flattens, as it were, all the previous dimensions, not only of the origin and consequently of history, but also of what is accidental and arbitrary, deep and superficial. In this last move, if there is something fundamental or a true depth, it lies not only on the surface. In fact, the only thing that is fundamental or truly deep is the surface itself as its own, undecidedly ontological and or epistemological phenomenon. Thus, at the end of the interview, in an apparent declension from Derrida's own development of the supplement, the surface rises fundamentally. This is the quote. Malabou. And the supplement, is it necessary, accidental? The question of the surface is, in this regard, fundamental. The surface, seen as a point of contact, is also that point where we let go, nous désaisissons, at the same time of the difference between that which is arbitrary and accidental, deep and superficial. There lies maybe the true depth, end of quote. But what exactly is this superficial depth at the end of this interview? Is it the epigenetic superficial depth of the biological subject, of the epistemological subject, of the ontological subject, or of all of these dimensions and fields, biology, epistemology, ontology, without or before the subject? Or is it just a structural or even architectural feature, like a narthex in a church? In my last section. Let this person in. Come on in. There you go. Move on. Very early on, I'm a Beckettian, so Beckett had to come here at some point. Very early on in The Unnameable, the third volume of Beckett's trilogy, which begins with the question, where now? The voice gives a tentative description of the place in which it is located. This is, there you go. The voice. The place is no doubt vast. Dim, intermittent lights suggest a kind of distance. To tell the truth, I believe they are all here, at least from Morphy on. I believe we are all here, but so far I have only seen Malone. Another hypothesis, they were here, but are here no longer. I shall examine it after my fashion. Are there other pits, deeper down, to which one accesses by mind? A stupid obsession with depth, stupide indice de la profondeur. Are there other places set aside for us, and this one where I am, with Malone, merely their narthex? I thought I had done with preliminaries. No, we have all been here forever, we shall all be here forever, I know it. No more questions. Is not this rather the place where one finishes vanishing? End of quote. Such a question as the last one, after the denunciation of an obsession, or as the original French text has it, of a haunting, indice de la profondeur, of depth, or of a haunting of depth, brings us back to the aforementioned désistement that Malabou underscores in a properly plastic Hegelian reading. What is more striking, however, when we keep in mind the quote from Malabou, where she designates the surface as the true depth, is the unnameable linking of this obsessive haunting depth with the narthex. That is to say, the preliminary or introductory space of a church or basilica. Structurally, the narthex is a paragon, but not just any paragon. It designates not only a framing device in between belonging and not belonging to the world, ergon, but also the entry, the initial or the vestibular space, literally the epigenetic or superficial space before the actual body of the building. In some buildings, as if commenting on the liminal jeu or switch from superficial or exterior to profound or interior, there are two narthexes, as in the Kora Church in Istanbul. Needless to say, in this particular building, the double construction of this inaugural or epigenetic space is all the more haunting, since the church's name, its history, and the mosaics in the narthexes refer to the multiple meanings of the term Kora in ancient Greek. In ancient Greek, Christ as the land of the living. Well, I'm going to try. And Mary, the mother of Jesus, as the container of the uncontainable. Now, this narthex from where the voice in the unnameable speaks or writes, particularly in its epigenetic dimension, in between or rather switching between being a surface and a depth, acts structurally, the surface, as the place there where it speaks, or là où ça parle, of the psychoanalytic notion of the unconscious, which Lacan rightly connects with the inaugural epigenetic surface of philosophy, the entry or narthex to Plato's cave. And then the quote from Lacan. My seminar was not where it speaks, là où ça parle, as people happen to say jokingly. It brought forth the place from which it could speak. The place in question is the entrance to the cave, towards the exit of which Plato guides us. While one imagines seeing the psychoanalyst entering here. But things are not that easy, as it is an entrance one can only reach just as it closes. The place will never be popular with tourists. And the only way for it to open up a bit is by calling from the inside. End of quote. We all know the story of the cavern quite well, or at least one of the versions in the text, where one of the natural-born prisoners is liberated and gets to confusedly go through the anagogical process, from shadows to puppets, to puppeteers, to the outside, to blindness, to likenesses and reflections on water, to the things themselves, to the appearances in the heavens and heaven itself, to daylight, into finally the sun's light. But the complete story is more complex. Some are born outside, others must come back, the philosophers, like the psychoanalysts here, they must come back to be laughed at first, but then to teach the others, confusedly, how to make the same ascent. This series of movements crossing back and forth the narthex complicates where ça parle, or the place where it could speak. If this is the place of the Lacanian unconscious, as, quote, a concept founded on the trail left by that which operates to constitute the subject, end of quote, then this is the place of our constitution, if not of our origin. In other words, if, as Lacan says, the only way for it to open up a bit is by calling from the inside, this is not because here we access finally the core of the subject, but because the subject as signifier is constituted by the nachträglich presupposition of this interior, not from outside nor inside, but from its narthex or epigenetic surface. Nevertheless, such a call as constitution, in order for it to speak and for us to listen, requires a definite regression, or at least the recognition of an inevitable anteriority and exteriority. So, moving on to the last part. In a recent article titled Narrative Voice, Heteropoiesis and the Outside, focused on the first three installments of Pascal Quignard's Dernier Royaume, and which is part of his upcoming book, Rethinking Literary Naturalism, Proust and Quignard After Life, Ian James shows how in this text, the subject's own autopoiesis is always already a heteropoiesis precisely through the constitution of a certain narthex, the necessary and insistent anterior space that not only supported the subject's origin, but continues to support its homeostasis and self-sustaining autopoietic movement. Quote, the auto of autopoiesis as a possibility of self-reproduction and self-maintenance needs to be qualified and also understood as the hetero of a renewed conception or logic of heteropoiesis, understood now as the possibility of a self-reproduction and self-maintenance in relation to the constitutive order, to an anterior field of alterity and exteriority. End of quote. What is fascinating about Dernier Royaume, following James, is that this fragmentary long novel of Quignard shows how the narthex, as the closing yet insisting space of both our origination and homeostasis, applies not only to our biological, psychological, and/or psychoanalytic constitution, but also to every dimension of human experience. Here we go back to Rosenthal's definition of human life as, quote, the possibility of something single, continuous, and present to itself, extension, end of quote. We can see in Quignard's text an attempt to expose this multifarious extension, together with its obscure origin and no less obscure continuous foundation in a variety of fields, disciplines, or realms. In other words, and to paraphrase an expression from Deleuze's difference of repetition, in its fragmentary yet continuous quest for the origin or for what is anterior or preterite, Dernier Royaume raises the originating and sustaining grounds of experience, of all types of experience, in order to reveal the abysses underneath. In other words, to see their constant disappearing act of foundation and constitution, the effacing deep non-human history of the origins of the human. It's a quote from Ian's article. Quote, Dernier Royaume exposes also the generative impossibility of human consciousness being able to grasp the world of sense and meaning that precedes and produces the human and all its symbolic forms. In this way, impossibility can be seen to strike the entirety of our human modes of storytelling and self-narration. Literary, certainly, but also the social, political, philosophical, and metaphysical stories that we have told ourselves and can tell ourselves from the point at which we now stand looking into the opaque past and deep history of our imagination, myths, and self-representations as they withdraw and disappear into their non-human origin. End of quote. Thus, it cannot but efface itself in its appearing or surfacing. Thus, if it cannot but efface itself in its appearing or surfacing, is this origin always new and our view of it ever a regression instead of always a new creation? What is the actual paradigm of our origin at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century? And has it changed much from the one we lived through in the last century and before? Or to go back to our initial question, what is life and what is a soul in our time? And is it different than before? In the same article, Ian James connects Quignard's notion of the jadi, this anterior dimension, this quote, anterior dimension, which is unlocatable as a past instance of presence, and which, in constituting the present as such, also evades its grasp and is therefore, in a sense, immemorial, end of quote, to Derrida's notion of the trace. However, unlike Derrida, James clarifies, quote, Quignard associates the anteriority of le jadi unequivocally with nature. Quoting Quignard inside the quote of James, nature is antique time as that which has always gone before, or in the original French, comme jadis, end of quote. Now, in the last chapter of her book, La Chambre du Milieu, Malabou also sees a step beyond the trace by looking into the paragon of the natural sciences, biology. More importantly, this step beyond the trace, literally it's effacing or erasure, is also a going back, a literal regression into a more ancient memory. Quote Malabou, it is about, again, going beyond the trace, about erasing it, about entering its more ancient memory, about going back towards that memory which cicatrization has not completely scabbed over, cicatrized, end of quote. As it is easily understood, this effort to go beyond the trace into a scarless memory is an expression of the medical research into stem cells and the possibility of regeneration of limbs, organs, and potentially of full human fetuses. As this research has shown, while most adult cells, keeping their specific difference, could generate similar cells to those from the tissue they come from, some among them, quote, stem cells of the dermis, could transform into different types of cells. For example, nervous or muscular. One says then that they transdifferentiate themselves, end of quote. A couple of pages later, Malabou, as if foreseeing the level of politicization that any mention of transdifferentiation would potentially carry a few years later, after she wrote this text, she questions, after this, she questions the general view that it is the moral dilemma of cloning that gives pause to the public. She sees instead a bigger epistemological and moral shock, the return or a step back to connect with the lost time of our origin, that is to say, with the jadi. This is the quote. Voilà. Quote, it is thus not again, as one believes too often, the ethical legitimacy of cloning that creates a problem, but the fact that the latter reconnects with lost time. And here she quotes a popular book at the time she was writing, La Chambre du Milieu, Fabrice Papillon and Axel Kant's Le Secret de la Salamandre, La Médecine and Quête de l'immortalité. Quote, biologists had thus to resolve a big question, to make a cell capable of one unique task, tell the story of a whole life, how to make it find again the memory of its origin, end of quote. The real scandal thus will not be the exact copying of an individual or the recreation of a human, motherless, fatherless, in a tube. Instead, it is the event of going back, so far back, in the heritage of our lives, as far back as what Plato called Cora in the Timaeus, to a place beyond and before all difference, traces, and differentiations, a place of pure plasticity from where not only the human, male, female, non-binary, hermaphrodite, neither, nor in between, and not even only the animal or plant, but also from where or on which everything and every being, every differentiation takes place. A place that is not its, anybody's or anything's proper place, since it does not exist yet there, but that we must always presuppose, as its interior is narthex within its choratic church, from where or on which, as its surface, it as life is called to be. Thank you.
Voila. Okay. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so I just need to orientate myself here. I'm going to be working two machines, so I feel a bit like a sort of.
Is that okay?
Right, great. Okay, so here's the title of the talk: Thinking with Three Surfaces, Biosemiotics, Plasticity, and the Limit Point of Immanence. Thinking with three surfaces: in, around, and out of contemporary biosemiotics. But why only three? Why not all the multiple surfaces and cells and membranes that in their millions make up the different levels of organization of biological life? If the stakes of today's discussions turn around a contemporary battle within the thinking of biological life more broadly, between the legacies of empiricism and materialism on the one hand, and those of idealism and phenomenology on the other, then might this insistence on the number three presage some kind of clandestine backdoor return or lingering vestigial presence of idealism, and specifically of Hegelian thought, in which, of course, three is an ever recurrent magic number? Or why not perhaps just one surface, that of a biological organism's outer boundary, a single surface that circumscribes the enclosed boundedness of the organism and gives it unity and individuality? Here we might follow, amongst others, Maturana and Varela and their theory of autopoiesis. In his essay of 1970 entitled Biology of Cognition, Humberto Maturana wrote, "The organism ends at the boundary that is its self-referring organization, that its self-referring organization defines in the maintenance of its identity. The theory of autopoietic self-organization requires an operative closure that allows the biological organism to function as a self-sustaining and self-reproducing system. And in this way, its outer boundary, the single surface upon which is the single surface upon which the activity of life depends." As I've noted elsewhere, there is arguably a residual neo-Kantian orientation in Maturana and Varela's theory, and they have been more broadly charged, wrongly, I think, with enclosing the organism with a kind of solipsistic self-referentiality and perceptual or cognitive idealism. Towards the beginning of his 2008 work, Biosemiotics, an examination into the signs of life and the life of signs, the Danish biologist Jesper Hofmeyr also and similarly signals the central importance of an organism's outer barrier. And here he is thinking in terms of the surface of the human skin and its role as an interface with the outer world and its environment. He writes, "Generally, the skin might be considered as a user interface that couples us to the outer world. On the one hand, the skin thus serves as a kind of topological boundary, while on the other hand, its semiotic capacity opens us up to the world. The emphasis on the skin as an interface with an exterior environment rather than on an outer boundary which affords operative closure and autopoietic unity is crucial here. We're not talking about an enclosure, but about a surface boundary that exposes to the world as much as it encloses and defines a living individual." By 2008, when he writes this book, Hofmeyr had established himself as one of the leading figures in the nascent biological discipline of biosemiotics, having written a very wide range of theoretical papers devoted to its various aspects, as well as having authored in 1991 a seminal paper on co-duality, arguably a founding moment in modern biosemiotics. As a contemporary discipline, biosemiotics can be said to formally establish itself after a series of international gatherings of like-minded researchers that took place from 2001 onwards. Gatherings that led to the establishment of the International Society for Biosemiotic Studies in 2005 and its official journal, Biosemiotics, in 2008, with Hofmeyr being a key figure in this process of disciplinary founding and invention. It's interesting that when Hofmeyr describes the skin as a user interface that couples us to the outer world, he also suggests this interface serves as a site of self-reference or of inward reference, one which underpins our experience of selfhood, and again, this both echoes and differs from Maturana and Varela's emphasis on the organismal unity and identity that is afforded by an outer boundary. But where there was a neo-Kantian vestige, arguably, in the theory of autopoiesis, Hofmeyr explicitly cites Maurice Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of embodiment and of bodily subjectivity as a key theoretical orientation for understanding skin as a semiotic user interface with the world. So it might be surmised once again that the legacy of idealism, and here of phenomenology, remains as a vestigial presence in these two moments of biological thinking that evoke and bestow a key role upon a single surface. It's also true that a strain of neo-Kantianism is markedly present in the immediate theoretical and philosophical hinterland of biosemiotics. It's present in the thought of Jacob von Uexküll and his Umwelt theory, in the semiotics of Thomas Seebuck, and in the work of Gregory Bateson, all of whom exert a direct influence on the emergence of biosemiotics in the 1990s and in the first decade of the new millennium. Similarly, it is not unusual to find in the literature of biosemiotics references to Schelling, Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, and once again, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, also Simondon, actually, just a note. All of which might suggest that this nascent field of biology never quite escapes the orbit of the idealist and phenomenological legacy. Yet, as I have again argued at some length on more than one occasion elsewhere, modern or contemporary biosemiotic explicitly slows off the neo-Kantian vestiges that mark its immediate precursors and influences. And in this way, it should be understood as a distinct form of novel realism and materialism, entirely different from the various forms of materialism and empiricism with which we might be more readily familiar. The key to this novel realism and materialism lies in which biosemiotics, in fact, can be shown to think with three and not one or two surfaces. For, in fact, it immediately becomes clear that although the skin for Hofmeyr enjoys something of a privileged position as that surface user interface that gives the organism inner self-reference and outer environmental reference, is just one interface amongst many in the biological structuring of, I quote, the emergent autonomy of various levels of organization. As Hofmeyr further puts it, the human skin serves as the outermost semiotic interface for an organic community of some 50 million individual living cells. The initial emphasis on skin is in fact an extension of the key role that biosemiotics gives to membranes and surfaces as such, in its account of biological life as sign activity. For biosemiotics, cellular life is primarily a matter of membranes and the sign activity that passes across their interior and exterior surfaces. Membranes or proteins topologically linked to membranes, inner and exterior surfaces, control by far the most of what goes on in a cell. What this means for Hofmeyr is that biological organization and structure are spatial and topological in a very specific and fundamental manner. The coordination of growth and development in multicellular organisms requires the constituent cells to engage in activities that reflect their exact spatial position in body and tissue. These specifications cannot be known from the DNA or gene because the DNA cannot know where in the organism any given constituent cell is located. Such knowledge must be obtained solely through the cell's communicative surfaces. What we see here, I would argue, is a shift in the informational paradigm of biology. a shift in the manner in which biological informational code is to be understood, but more broadly also a shift away from a central emphasis placed on the informational code of DNA towards a more topological orientation. This is quite familiar to us all now after, I think, the last papers. In this way, biosemiotics can be aligned with other largely unrelated developments in recent and contemporary biology, which question or to seek to displace the informational paradigm of DNA. For instance, the origin of life research conducted by the British biologist Nick Lane, who Adam mentioned, which places an energetics of membranes and surfaces at the very center of life processes, or the work of the Italian mathematical biologist Giuseppe Longo that emphasizes functional context and gives a full-on assault on what he sees as a fetishized gene centrism within the mainstream of contemporary biology. Surface and functional context offer the key to understanding the way in which biosemiotics both contests the primacy afforded to the role played by DNA and yields a transformation of our understanding of biological information, such that it can speak of life as semiosis or of sign activity. It is not, of course, that the central role played by DNA is ignored. Hoffmeyer again. The DNA molecules contain in the nucleotide base code array of vital instructions, mainly aimed at the growing embryo, enabling tissues and cells to produce whatever protein resources that may be needed in different contextual situations, as advertised by the reception of molecular signs at the cell surface. The key here, though, is the role played by contextual surface and molecular sign in the reading off of DNA instructions. What this tells us is that DNA ceases to have an exclusively primary or originarily determinative role in the formation, development, and maintenance of a living organism. Rather, living cells, through their membranes, use DNA to construct the organism, not vice versa. This opens the doorway for biosemiotics to move decisively beyond purely mechanistic and physicalist orientations, which would reduce cell biology to molecular biology and molecular biology exclusively to biochemistry, and biochemistry ultimately to chemistry and physics. Biosemiotics embraces a qualitative organicism in which function, context, and the purposive activity of life as such depend on an order of meaning that inheres within the operations of the cell. Upon the surfaces, one might say, to echo what's been said already, the inner environment of the organism and its interactions with its surrounding environment. It's at this point that the first of our three surfaces can be specified and thought, and this in Hoffmeyer's central notion developed with Klaus Emesch of code duality. He defines code duality in 2008 as, I quote, a recursive and unending exchange of messages between analog and digital coding surfaces. So immediately we can see the manner in which the multiple surfaces of cells and membranes that in their millions make up a biological organism can be reduced to two, not one, the organism's outer boundary or skin, but rather to two. On the one hand, the digital surface of the DNA code and the information that it bears, and on the other, the analog surfaces of cells and membranes as such. In an earlier paper dating from 1998 entitled Surfaces Inside Surfaces on the Origin of Agency and Life, Hoffmeyer wrote, code duality refers to the fact that living systems always form a unity of two coded and interacting messages, the analogically coded message of the organism itself and its redescription in the digital code of the DNA. The question arises here relates to how these two messages are to be understood, but also how we should understand their unity and their interaction. The decisive point to note, perhaps, is that this interaction and unity of messages relies on the functional context and purposive activity of cells, organs, and biological organisms, and is therefore an operation of an order of meaningful activity. Yet this order of meaning, as thought by biosemiotics, differs sharply from the kind of naturalistic or physicalistic accounts given by, say, teleosemantics or biosemantics, which try to describe meaning, intentional directedness, or mental representation in biological organisms, but do so in very different terms. Hofmeyr and Amesh's 1991 paper on co-duality is seminal because it proposes to think the interaction and unity of digital and analog coding surfaces in terms of sign activity, and more specifically in the interpretation of coded messages understood as signs. What we propose, write Hofmeyr and Amesh, is that the traditional paradigm of biology be substituted by a semiotic paradigm, the core of which is that biological form is understood primarily as sign, whether analog or digital. It is here that biosemiotics makes a decisive and much questioned and at times contested conceptual and theoretical move, taking its model of sign theory from the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce and mediating it through the work of more recent semioticians such as Thomas Seebuck and of biological thinkers influenced by cybernetics such as Gregory Bateson. Peirce, it may be recalled, understands a sign as an inseparable unified relationship between an object, a sign vehicle, and an interpretant. The Peircean sign therefore has a triadic structure with an interpretant able to stand as the object for another sign relation, which can then lead to a potentially limitless chain of signs and an ongoing activity or process of semiosis, on which can extend through the natural realm of biology and indeed into the realm of environmental activity and communication that passes through all of plant and animal life and the negotiations with the world around them, up to and including the realm of human communication, meaning, and culture. What is important to retain here is that for Peirce, the unified relation of sign, the sign, composed of object, sign vehicle, interpretant, describes a process of the communication and production of a form. And in this context, the so-called interpretant is not to be understood as an interpreter in the way we might normally think the term. As Peirce writes, a sign may be defined as the medium for the communication of a form. It is not necessary that anything possessing consciousness should be concerned. So what this means for the appropriation of biosemiotics, the appropriation by semiotics of Peircean sign theory, is that when the digital surface and coding of DNA is read by the analog surface of a membrane to produce a further biological form, there is a specific causation at work that can be understood in the relation of object, the DNA code, to sign vehicle, the analog surface of a membrane, to the creation of a biological form, interpretant. Peirce describes the one-way or unilateral causality of the sign in terms of its irreducibly triadic structure. As a medium, the sign is essentially in a triadic relation to its object, which determines it, to its interpretant, which it determines. In its relation to the object, the sign is passive, that is to say, its correspondence to the object is brought about by an effect upon the sign, the object remaining unaffected. On the other hand, in its relation to the interpretant, the sign is active, determining the interpretant without itself thereby being affected. There are a number of things that might be noted here. Firstly, the insistence by Peirce that the interpretant need not possess anything like consciousness, and that the interpretation at work in a semiotic process need not be the work of a mind, is decisive. There's a lot to be said here, and if anyone's interested, we can talk about it. Certainly, in the biosemiotic assimilation of Peircean sign theory, this is not the reintroduction of idealism by the back door. If meaning in biosemiotics is to be understood in terms of the functional and environmental contexts, which influence the way digital DNA surfaces and analog membrane surfaces interact, we are not talking about minds hidden in biological structures, but simply about the manner in which topological positioning gives meaning to processes that can be related to the needs and operations of the organism. In the terms that biosemiotics borrows from Gregory Bateson, DNA coding is read out by analog membranes that produce biological forms is the difference that makes a difference. And the interpretant here is simply a response to a difference that has meaning because it happens in a context which is both topological and purposive for the ongoing life and survival of the organism. The triadic structure of the sign might indeed recall the triadic structure of the Hegelian dialectic, and Hegel's magic number 3. Indeed, Peirce freely admitted that, I quote, "My philosophy resuscitates Hegel, though in a strange costume." But the costume is everything, particularly when at the end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st, it is cut in a biological way. For what the biosemiotic assimilation of Peircean sign theory affords is an understanding of material and physical processes that, because of the complexity of their organization and because of the functionally and environmentally oriented activity of all life from the level of cells upwards, can be said to bear an order of qualitative meaning without the need to posit any residual realm of ideality. Signs and sign relations are real and produce real forms that interact with each other in a qualitatively lived manner. This order of qualitative meaning might, in Peircean terms, be called thirdness. And in the context of biosemiotic, it pertains to the activity of the interpretant as that which, affected by a difference, communicated by the sign vehicle from the object, makes a difference in any given semiotic system and its production of form. It is this thirdness which will give the third and final surface that can be added to the digital and analog surfaces of Hofmeyr and Emesch's code duality. To specify this third surface, coming towards the end, a very brief detour via the philosophy of Catherine Malabou, that thinker of plasticity of forms, will be helpful. Malabou, of course, has extensively developed a thinking of plasticity, originally elaborated out of a doctoral thesis on Hegel in relation to neuroscience and epigenetics. This is Hegel resuscitated once more, one might say, after Peirce, but once again in a very different costume. Especially in relation to epigenetics, she engages in a thinking of surface which closely resembles the biosemiotic theorizing of Hofmeyr. In her 2014 work, Before Tomorrow, Epigenesis and Rationality, Malabou's parallel reading of the epigenesis of reason in Kant and of biological epigenetic formation leads her to question whether we can speak of, I quote, I love this quote, "a hermeneutic latitude, the power of sense opened in the heart of the biological." In other words, the biology of epigenetics, according to Malabou, will also lead us to an understanding of life as some kind of semiosis. And with biosemiotics, as with biosemiotics, epigenetics for Malabou places the thinking of surface at the very center of the creation of biological form. In a short article entitled Epigenesis of the Text, Malabou develops a concept of what she calls epigenetic reading, one which emerges from an understanding of epigenetic processes as an operation of or on surfaces, or as surface effects. This is recapping what we saw with James's paper. Malabou stresses the way in which the epi of epigenetic processes needs to be understood not as might be more immediately derivable from its Greek origin, as referring to a positioning above or on top of, but rather precisely in terms of surface. The epi or above of epigenesis should be understood not as an extension that comes over something else, but as a surface effect. In geology, the epicenter is the point of projection of hypocenter, the underground site where an upheaval emerges on the surface of the Earth. Epigenetic modifications for Malabou are a matter of surface activity. Insofar as these modifications never alter the DNA sequence itself, epigenetics is said to work on the surface, epi, of the molecule. Moreover, contemporary epigenetics actually studies the transformation of mechanisms at work on the surface of DNA molecules during their transcription. Here we are very close to, and arguably in a complementary manner, the processes that Hofmeyr and Emesch describe in terms of code duality. Malabou insists that we take this central role played by surfaces in epigenetic processes seriously when she argues that we need to think through the full implications of the epi. In interpreting these epigenetic processes, we need to recast the way in which notions of surface and depth, or surface and ground, or foundation operate in thought itself. Back to what James is talking about. It's necessary to remain on the surface in some way, and this does not mean being superficial, but rather working where it occurs, at the point between the ground and the underground. In this way, she comes to develop the concept of epigenetic reading. The figure of reading has been at play here from the outset, with the introduction of code duality and its specific formulation of the manner in which the digital surface of the DNA code is read by the analog surfaces of membranes. From the biosemiotic perspective, it may be possible to come to speak of biotextuality, it may be possible to come to speak of biotextuality or of biosemiotic intertextuality, and to apply Malabou's understanding of epigenetic reading to the interpretation of biosemiotic activity in living organisms. Malabou writes, epigenetic reading is a way of making the epigenesis of a text appear, of finding the precise point of contact between times in a text, of exhibiting a surface which is not pre-programmed, a surface contact from which a form has to emerge. What she says of epigenesis here can, I think, be also said of semiosis. In this way, the notion of epigenetic reading, the need to, quote, exhibit a surface which is not pre-programmed, allows the third surface of biosemiotic operation to be given its final formulation. According to the Peircean schema of the triadic sign, the interpretant, as was indicated earlier, is unilaterally determined by the object by the mediation of the sign vehicle. But given that the interpretant only operates as such within specific topological surrounds and functional contexts that will be each time unique, there is a sense that the moment of qualitative thirdness enacted by the interpretant cannot be calculated or specified in advance or determined according to any efficient or mechanistic causality. What this also means is that biosemioticians who seek to examine semiotic processes within biological systems are themselves interpretants, standing at the end of a semiotic chain or network in which they themselves are participating. Just as epigenesis requires epigenetic reading at or on a surface, so biosemiosis requires a specific act of interpretation, which, it will become clear, also engages a surface. Thur von Uexküll, son of Jakob von Uexküll, and pioneer of the biosemiotic approach within psychosomatic medicine, has highlighted the key issue relating to the study of living organisms in terms of sign activity. We have to infer the meaning which vehicles assume as signs for living systems, from the way in which these systems behave towards their environment after the vehicles have acted upon their receptors. Thus, we have to interpret their behavior as semiosis of symptomization, that is, as symptoms of their biological state. The insight here is that if biosemiosis is to be taken as a process of interpretation at work within the processes of living systems, then as such, it is a process that itself interprets and that needs to be interpreted. The meaning of a biosemiotic relational sign action is inferred by reasoning or judgment because, as an immaterial qualitative relation, it cannot be directly observed in and of itself. As von Uexküll himself puts it, we cannot directly observe the interpretant according to which a living system codes effects of the environment on its receptors into signs. Therefore, whatever may be at stake here by way of the outcome of scientific observation and experiment, it has to be interpreted from the system's behavior and has to be inferred against the grain, as it were, by reconstructing their history. One might conclude from this that biosemiotics, even if it were to be practiced according to qualitative methodologies which might complement quantitative approaches, always and necessarily follows a methodological path that much more resembles the procedures of humanities than it does of the hard sciences. Biology is literature, as I think Adam said earlier. This is a path of interpretation, of inference based on the reconstruction of contingent relational contexts, and therefore of judgment in relation to something that cannot be observed, rather than the empirical verifiable determination of something that presents itself objectively. Klaus Emesch comes very close to acknowledging this in his own terms when he notes signs have intrinsic, publicly observable, as well as intrinsic phenomenal aspects. We can only access the meaning of a sign from its observable effects, but observation of the phenomenal experiences of another organism may either be impossible or highly mediated. Reality exceeds what exists as actually observable. If the mesh is right, that reality exceeds what exists as actually observable, then it should be clear that any strictly empiricist or reductively physicalist biology that removes the qualitative element from life processes may be able to preserve and guard a certain objectivist posture or stance. Yet this will inevitably come at the cost of obscuring, eliminating, and thereby foreclosing an essential dimension of reality by reducing everything to chemistry and molecules. From the biosemiotic perspective, the question becomes one of how science itself can come to account for those unobservable aspects of reality, and thereby come to a broader, more inclusive picture. It does so, I would argue, by placing itself at the third surface, that which separates the objectively observable from the qualitatively unobservable, the visible from the invisible. It separates the empirical determinable from that which is qualitatively immanent within biosemiosis as such. In this way, the biosemiotician stands as an interpretant on the surface of a field of semiotic immanence, and at what I call the limit point of immanence. In his critical elaboration of what he calls Peirce's semiotic immanence, that's his term, the American philosopher Rocco Gangle points out that the triadic structure of the sign cannot simply stand as a theoretical model to be applied in an abstract way that would leave the scientist or semiotician in a position of transcendence from and separation from that which is being observed or interrogated. Thus, for Gangle, Peirce's triadic logic of the sign cannot be applied merely theoretically, but can only concretely and experientially be performed in a way that changes the performer itself. Gangle's insight has far-reaching implications for the whole of the biosemiotic enterprise that seeks to take its primary orientation from Peircean semiotic theory. It develops in a more philosophical and radical manner Tur von Uxku's point cited above, relating to the necessity of inference and interpretation in the biosemiotic investigation of living systems. Gangle notes that since any interaction with semiotic processes must necessarily be a continuation of and participation in the furtherance of those processes in ongoing sign activity, such an undertaking can only occur in determinable and self-implicating contexts of meaning. It is therefore necessary to step into a triadic relation in order to manifest that relation as such. As a theoretical tool for the explanation, modeling, and possible experimentation of an investigation of biological systems, biosemiotics, insofar as it builds on Peircean sign theory, would in practice necessarily implicate biosemioticians themselves in the semiotic processes of living systems that they study. That is to say, in producing their own distinctive forms or elements of knowledge, they are themselves interpretants standing at the end of complex, potentially limitless semiotic chains and networks, and thus their acts step back into and remain in a relational posture of immanence with regard to those very chains and networks. They are immanent interpretations and not transcendent representations of biosemiosis. Semiotic immanence dictates, according to Gangle, that, the triadic sign may be experienced or participated in as triadic, but can only be theoretically modeled at the expense of losing its triadic quality. This really is coming towards the end now. It might be argued, therefore, that biosemiotics inaugurates within biological science an observation problem that is in a certain way analogous to that which occurs in the measurement problem of quantum systems in physics, namely that the observation or measurement entails an interaction with the system that is being measured. Yet in this case, it may not necessarily be a question of observation affecting or causing a state change within the system observed, but rather of observation constituting a further development and supplementation in an ongoing chain of semiosis. If Gangle's account of semiotic immanence clarifies what is at stake in what I have here called the limit point of immanence, then I think it follows that semiotic realities cannot be seen, and therefore they have to be constructed. And in this way, it's clear that such constructions will themselves be further semiotic acts. On this basis, it can be said that biosemiotic interpretation is an act that occurs within an ongoing process of semiosis in the domain of thirdness, always occurs on a third surface, That surface is encountered by the biosemiotician when they observe biological processes and to seek to interrogate them semiotically in terms of a field of qualitative meaning that physical processes bear. Biosemiotic interrogation, and one might add, biosemiotic theorizing of living systems as such, and in general, understood as the activity of signs, are themselves also semiotic acts that take place at the limit point of immanence in relation to an anterior field of immanence. They are, in a way, as acts of an interpretant that comes at the end or after semiotic chains determined by the semiotic immanence that comes before, whilst not being able to present it as such in any empirically or observable form. So here, to absolutely conclude, the limit point of immanence is thought as the third surface which a biosemiotician necessarily encounters when trying to investigate the triadic unity of digital DNA messages, analog membrane messages, and their interaction in the production of biological forms. Investigating biological organisms in terms of this triadic unity forces practicing biosemioticians and theorists, to echo Malabou, to work on and with this third surface as it occurs. It allows biosemiotics to chart a distinctive path between materialism and empiricism, idealism and phenomenology. For from this perspective, signs, sign activity, and semiotic immanence are all real, encountered as real as they determine the biosemiotician as an interpretant on the third surface of the limit point of immanence. Here we are talking about nothing other than physical and material processes, but we are able to understand the manner in which qualitative meaning inheres within the physical and material without invoking anything ideal. On the third surface, the ontology of the natural biological sign and the epistemology of biosemiotics as a thought or scientific practice collapse into each other. For if biosemiotic investigation and theorizing are all placed on this third surface in relation to an anterior field of immanence which determines the interpretant, but which cannot be objectively determined in return, and which can therefore only be inferred or interpreted, then biosemiotics as such takes on kind of a status of a realist modeling, which is endowed with only a weak ontological force and a certain epistemological modesty, one that comes with interpretation understood as such. So three and only three surfaces. But with those three surfaces, both the understanding of biological life and its scientific investigation potentially find themselves transformed. Thank you.